Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Welcome to The Forge.
Hello, Gamer Nation, and welcome to The Forge, a Genesys RPG podcast covering everything that you need to know about the latest and greatest from Fantasy Flight Games, Genesys Foundry, and the Genesys role-playing game. I'm your host, GM Hooley, and tonight we have not one, but two special guests, one of whom I just get a little bit giddy about. Yes, I will own that word, and someone who shares with my giddiness. Well, at least I hope he does anyway. Otherwise, I've left myself well out in the cold. GM Chris, how's it going?
I am giddy about nothing.
Really?
No, not really. I get giddy about everything, actually. I'm hyper giddy about most things. I'm great, brother. How are you?
I'm really, really well. Well, I mean, I went to Oz Comic Con here in Brisbane, and I was bitterly disappointed. But I think that's probably got more to do with there wasn't a lot to do, but that's a side note altogether.
Bitterly disappointed.
Bitterly disappointed. I went last year and it was amazing. But this year, yeah, it was just, there was something, there just was no energy in the air and everything felt very, very mellow. There wasn't a lot of exhibitors.
Like six mates standing around like trading baseball cards or what?
It was a little bit like that. Oh, there were a few more than six mates. But yeah, I just felt that there wasn't as much to do and it wasn't very exciting. So, but hey, look, the kids kind of had fun, so that's all that really matters. Yes, I was less than impressed. But other than that,
you were less than impressed.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, okay. Well, then you know what? Let's get your impressiveness, ratio and threshold back up, because we have, as you said, some amazing guests coming onto the show tonight. I can't wait to get it started. Should we just get into this? Should we get into announcements? Talk about what's new on the Foundry going on?
Look, I think that's a really good plan, and we'll do that in Stoking the Fire.
Stoking the Fire.
And welcome to Stoking the Fire, a segment dedicated to letting you know all there is to know about the releases from the Genesys Foundry and the Genesys role-playing game. But first, Chris, would you like to tell us about the D20 Radio podcast of the week?
I would love to, because we are talking about the sheer and utter mind-bending horror of the Miskatonic University Podcast.
Wow.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, devoted to all things Call of Cthulhu RPG. MUP is hosted by keepers John, Dan, Murph, and Chad, who keep the eldritch fires of the great old ones burning. And their most recent episode I loved, episode 181, Podcasting Cage Match, is a show that they did live from Providence and Necronomicon 2019.
Wow.
Where they actually went head to head in an interview with another Call of Cthulhu podcast. It was a great episode. You got to check it out. Especially if you're a fan of any Mythos related work, especially the Call of Cthulhu RPG. And you guys can find this show and many more amazing gaming and geekery podcasts over at d20radio.com.
All right. Yeah, look, I love that podcast, and I'm really starting to get more into Cthulhu lately, mainly because, there's a few people that I know that have requested that we play Cthulhu. So, and actually at Comic-Con yesterday, there was Chaosiism had a booth, which was quite surprising. So it was the only gaming there, but...
Well, it's interesting, Call of Cthulhu is a fine RPG, but you can actually play Cthulhu Mythos quite easily in Genesys.
Absolutely.
Often using a lot of the things that are in one of the products that's out there on the Foundry right now that I know we're going to talk about later on in our show with another one of our special guests.
Indeed. Alrighty, so let's open up the Foundry Vault and take a look at what's inside. Now, firstly, from Fantasy Flight Games is the announcement of the Foundry Spotlight.
Hell yes. So like on Monday, FFG announced their Genesis Foundry Spotlight, which will be a regular recurring article series on their website, which will be used to, as the name suggests, focus on the Foundry and the content that we here at the Forge Podcast are also promoting. Now, as I said, this will be an article on their website monthly that will focus on one piece of Foundry content. A member of the FFG RPG team will read through the material, summarize it, and highlight some of the things that they think are particularly great about that particular product. And then they're going to post that spotlight article directly on the FFG website for the entire world to see.
and realistically, that's an incredible promotional opportunity for the author to help sell their product. But how are they going to decide which Foundry content gets the spotlight treatment? I'm glad that you asked, because I know I did. And, well, they answered it right there on the article. FFG wants you to send them an email to foundryspotlight@fantasyflightgames.com and tell them what Foundry product you want them to spotlight. As they say in the article, just put the name of the product in the email subject line and include a brief 1 to 2 sentence reason why you want FFG to review that particular article or that particular product.
That's right. And then basically on the 15th of each month, they're going to tally up the emails they've gotten, and whatever product gets the most votes will be the product that's featured at the end of the month. So please jump on the Drive-Thru RPG, grab those products, listen to our podcast for the products that we're suggesting you take a look at, and get those emails in. And a little bit of self-promotion, because I haven't done too much of it here.
Yep.
I do have my own product, obviously, on the Foundry. My labor of love, the familiar setting. And for those of you who have played it, or if you want to give me a shout out, that would be really awesome. I would love to get a featured article on FFG's site. That would be great.
Absolutely. Look, I've played Familiar and absolutely loved it. It's it's definitely unique, which is out there. In comparison to other items which are out there, but I absolutely love it. You can have so much fun with it. So it's a not too serious look. I mean, you can, I guess, but it's a not too serious look at the fantasy.
Man. I've already talked to some players that have gone down some serious campaign paths with it.
Oh, really? Wow. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Very cool.
Watership Down style all the way.
Oh, that's cool. Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. It's a niche product, but there's a lot of great products out there. Yep. And so if you guys have one that you'd really like to recommend and get there on that spotlight article, get that email in. There's a lot of great products. And speaking of products, Hooli, and great products on the Foundry.
Yes.
What is new on the Foundry?
Now, first up is a new addition to the Foundry, Mega City Magic from Thomas Deeney. Basically, this is a supplement that lets you turn your Android game into a full-on Shadowrun game. It's designed to allow game masters and players to fully and properly incorporate magic into their cyberpunk settings, something that I desperately want to do, specifically calling out using magic in Android. I'll put my tongue back in. It includes new character creation paths that combine 7 character heritages and 3 magical approaches to transhumanity. 11 new careers to add magic to your cyberpunk game, fantasy magic-focused cybernetics, modifications and gear, a set of mechanics for summoning spirits and elementals, which is very, very cool, and a heap of GM advice for layering on astral other space onto a sci-fi setting. It also includes magical threats and adversaries from well-connected occultists to dragons that run global corporations. So Shadowrun. And this is all only for $3.99, which is absolute value for money. And if you haven't got it, do it.
Yes. Now, we also saw the release of a new setting for Genesis from AJ Panday called The Gods of New Braemar, an original creation of a fantasy setting. It is 59 pages, and it covers pretty much all the basics you'd expect. Archetypes, careers, talents, adversaries, equipment, all that. Mm-hmm. The production value, to be honest, Hooli, is a little lackluster. Which I don't necessarily have a problem with. We've talked about that before. But it is especially surprising considering that the file size of this 60-page PDF is over 330 megs.
Wow.
and there's only a single piece of hand-drawn art. It's a world map. Looks like it was sketched in pencil. The rest is simply laid out. AJ, if you're listening, brother, you really need to compress your file. And honestly, I mean, this is a pay-what-you-want product, which is good. Clearly, it's a labor of love from the author, but I mean, I got to be upfront, and I hate saying this, but from my standpoint, Hooli, it just felt a little bit lackluster in terms of its overall execution. Almost like somebody had a really well fleshed out home game setting that they created in probably another system, and then decided to just kind of thrust it into Genesis, where it, upon a read, it just comes off as fantasy setting number 17.
Right.
There's no real unique quirks or concepts that differentiate it from other offerings out there, such as Tyrannoth. And honestly, there was also a decision in the setting to practically recreate existing material in Genesis in the core book when the need wasn't really there. You don't need to reskin a laborer class. Just say use the laborer career. You know what I mean?
Yep, absolutely.
Or the archetype, excuse me. I just didn't find much to differentiate it from other fantasy settings. So it's there, though. It is pay what you want. And of course, if you guys, you can obviously, download it for a penny if you wish. And if you feel that, wow, you really like it, you're getting good use out of it, you can always increase your pay after the fact, But honestly, I hopefully in time, Mr. Panday will kind of update this further and really add a lot more oomph and kind of uniqueness to it. Because clearly it's a labor of love from his part, but a little under par from my perspective.
No, that's fair enough. Look, I think when it comes to this sort of stuff, the best thing that anyone who might be downloading it can do for the author is to obviously give them feedback. If they're concerned about it, let them know. Sort of tell them why that it's not working for them and some suggestions on how they can improve it. This is all brand new for a lot of people, I think. So putting a little bit of a positive spin on it for people who are submitting stuff to the Foundry is a really, really good plan. And lastly, for fans of John Dunn's amazing Hope Prep School series about young heroes in a school for supers, they just dropped Home Prep School 0 Orientation Genesis Edition. Now, as we've seen from Hope Prep line, here's an example of something not originally written for Genesis, where they've clearly taken the time to really transition it and update it properly for the Genesis system. Not to mention offering something truly unique and unlike any other settings that are currently out there.
Absolutely.
Now, Zero Orientation is an entire adventure. And it represents the freshman year of new students at Hope Prep. It's written to be played as a bit of a standalone, or to introduce players and their starting characters to the Hope Preparatory School setting. It's filled with maps of the school, player handouts, and a range of NPCs, which will provide everything that the GM needs to run this setting really well. Now, this scenario also provides background and game information on the dreaded alchemical cabal. And the I still can't do it as good as you, though, Chris. The usual quality we've come to expect from Mr. Dunn, and it's available for $4.99. A great way to get new players into a great and unique setting.
Absolutely, awesome sauce. And listen, you guys can find these products and many more great Genesis Foundry content, of course, at drivethrurpg.com, simply by searching for Genesis Foundry.
Indeed. All right, Chris, so before we get into the main topic of tonight's show, do you want to get into some development and rules discussions?
Oh, I do. I'm kind of excited. I feel like rolling some dice, my friend, in a segment we like to call die casting.
Die casting.
The Forge Podcast is all about bringing new creations to the table, and the Genesis RPG provides us all with a powerful set of tools to do so, specifically through skills and talents. The die casting segment is about closely examining individual skills and talents and how they relate to the creations you craft. Last episode, we went through the ins and outs of grouped talents and even went so far as to craft our own home-brewed versions of Improved and Supreme Swift, which, Hooli, correct me if I'm wrong, our listeners can find right now on our Facebook page, right?
That is correct. Yeah, they can also go to the website as well, which is forgegenesis.com, and they'll be able to find it there as well.
Oh, fantastic. Well, tonight, we felt like it was time to return to the discussion of skills with a deep look at a skill related to our last episode on brawn-based archetypes, a skill that frankly gets no love from players or GMs. A skill that is, at worst, scorned and laughed at, and at best, leaves players giving a hearty shrug when it's mentioned. And that skill is the unappreciated and underutilized Resilience.
Indeed. Now, the skill players love to hate, in my opinion, because GMs simply don't know what to do with it, and players simply don't sort of see the use of it a lot of the time, so they don't necessarily put as much experience points into it. It's a bit of a black sheep on the skill list, which is a shame, as it's only one of 2 non-combat brawn-based skills in the game. So tonight we're going to crack Resilience open and shine a bright light deep inside. Now we're going to talk about the obvious and less obvious ways a good GM should bring Resilience into their games, as well as ways that players who've invested in this skill can make some solid suggestions for its use. Now, we may even do a little bit of house ruling of our own to give you some non-rules as written ways to spice up Resilience in your own games. So, Chris, let's start from the beginning. Let's set the expectations as we do.
Yeah. Basics of Resilience, guys. For those following along in your storybooks at home, open up your Genesys core rulebook, page 63. Resilience. I mean, honestly, if you had to sum it up, Hooli, it's the true skill of how hardy you are physically.
Yep.
Whether that's overcoming pain, fighting fatigue, shrugging off damaging conditions you're going through. It's what's weird about Resilience is it's kind of like a defensive skill.
Exactly.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, if you think of it like defense against the physical circumstances, whether you've created those circumstances yourself or whether they were thrust upon you, I guess.
Yes.
You know, you're using them to fend off the negative effects of, as the rulebook says, of sleep deprivation, poisons and toxins. And there's quite a few examples around the place in relation to that, and we'll get onto those shortly. Things like extreme temperatures or inhospitable environments. There's quite a few things which are out there which Resilience does use, which can perhaps be a little bit underutilized.
It's also worth noting it is a skill of natural healing and recovery, at least as far as the rules as written go in the core rulebook. Specifically, it's used to recover naturally critical injuries.
Yeah.
If you have a critical injury and you want to recover it naturally through natural rest and healing, it doesn't just happen. That critical injury will stay with you forever unless you can either get to a healer or naturally rest and make an appropriate resilience check to have it recover.
Exactly. And that's probably the time that it is used the most. And it's then highly up to the GM whether the rest of them come into play.
Yeah.
Sleep deprivation is not something that is seen very often. But as soon as you start talking fantasy settings where you're going from one point to the next and you have to do it on foot, it's not like you just jump in your hover car in Shadow of the Beanstalk and, you put it on autopilot and off you go. This is something that if you have to go from point A to point B in a hurry and you don't have the time, your sleep deprivation is going to be a big thing. Yeah.
And it also comes down to one of those things where, as a GM, if your players want to push it, really push it, you can use Resilience in some very creative ways. But maybe Hooli, that leads us into the next point of conversation here, which is about using Resilience correctly.
Yep.
Because I think that's probably a lot of the reason that it doesn't get the love it does, and the reason it's not used as much as it is because the situations that demand its usage are not commonly occurring as they should in people's games. So maybe we can talk about how, I mean, dude, you're a very experienced GM. So let's start there. I mean, as a GM using resilience in your game, how do you use it correctly?
Well, I'll be perfectly honest and say that resilience is something that I find really hard to bring in. Because a lot of the time when you're designing adventures, it's not the first thing that comes into your head. But as a GM, you have to dream up the situations where it does come into play. And you have to remember to use them, because there are going to be players that are going to, whether it be for character reasons, whether it be for story reasons, whether it be for just because they think that it's a skill that their characters have used in other campaigns that they've played, you have to remember to use them because they've spent XP on it. It's just like if you've got a talent such as knack for it, which is removing setback die, you want those players to be able to be using that because they've invested XP. Otherwise, they feel that they haven't invested XP. So if you're automatically going, oh, that character has got knack for it, so I'm not going to add any setback dice, you're removing the necessity for them to have spent that XP in the first place. So that's probably the first and most important thing, that you have to consider the player's investment in those skills. And when it comes to resilience, it operates like anything else. And if resilience is not a career skill for them, they can be investing upwards of well and truly over 100 XP into the one skill. So it's something to consider there.
Well, let's also talk about the inverse of that, though. Okay.
Yep.
I mean, let's. And this actually came up. This reminds me of one of the questions we answered in our last episode.
Yes.
We had a listener call in about the fact that he had an issue with surprise encounters because none of his players had cool. Right.
Exactly.
That no one had invested. Well, okay. So here's the deal. As a GM, you shouldn't let your players off the hook for frequent resilience checks when it's appropriate, or the situations that should call for them, strictly because they didn't put points into resilience. Okay? I mean, Hoolie's correct. When somebody has, you need to reward that. But beyond that, you need to tacitly encourage them to not ignore this stupid skill. It's again, God, none of us have any ranks in resilience. Why are you making us trek through the desert and make these checks? It's like,
well, they chose to go out in the desert.
Exactly. But let's talk about that, because there are, I think some of the fun we can have is by talking about some of the uncommon ideas. But let's start with the commons. What are some of the common adventure tropes that GMs can heavily rely upon to use resilience checks in regularly?
Absolutely. Well, look, I think, as I mentioned before, you've got the common walking from point A to point B, whether that be through, a trek through the desert, a forced march through the snow, things like that, even going through a forest. If you have to go through a jungle, with the humidity in the air, that's it's sapping of your energy. So, any sort of trek from one point to the next in a forced marched format is definitely worth a resilience check.
Now, the key there, though, is consequences. This is actually something that the core rulebook specifically mentions in the resilience section, where they say, should you make your players make a resilience check to cross a mountain range? No. Unless it's in the middle of a blizzard. Unless they're having to do a forced march without sleep for days at a time in order to beat a raiding party to a helpless village. Okay? So the key there is that unusual circumstance and consequences. But these guys are big damn heroes. You don't want to, it's like, oh, you need to make a walk to the next village through the forest. You don't need a resilience check for that.
No.
Unless it's not a forest. It's a sweltering jungle filled with poisonous creatures that's going to keep them constantly on edge. Or they have to move without sleep. Or it's, 42 degrees Celsius in the shade.
Yeah. I mean, even if it's something that they choose to do. So if you've said it's going to take 4 days to go from point A to point B, screen wipe and they're there. Well, if they say, well, no, we really need to be there in 2 days because we need to talk to this particular magister before we go on with the adventure, then you start going, okay, well, that's a forced march. That is something that you're going to need to, be making survival checks, or in this case, a resilience check, depending on where they're going and how they're doing it. So these are the things that you also should be looking at. Listen to what your players are saying. Give them it goes back to the yes and. You're providing them with, this is what the baseline is and no checks are required at all. And they can go, yep, we're going to do that. And they do it. But if they want to change that, well, yes, you can do that. But there's going to be a consequence. And that consequence would come down to, in this case, a resilience check.
Yes, forcing you to make the resilience check. Now, in these examples that we've just talked about, these are things that are either decisions the players have made or enhancements to decisions they've made. There are some other very common adventure tropes GMs can use resilience in that are really the players have no control over and are entirely in the purview of the GM.
Are we talking about venomous creatures, for example?
Yes. Venomous creatures or enemies with poison weapons. Any type of poisonous attribute in any type of attack. You can throw that in, and guess what, baby? They're gonna be rolling resilience checks.
Indeed. And that's something that a lot of people don't actually understand when it comes to exposure, is that, we hear about that a person has died from exposure and whatever else that we hear on the news and things like that. But that is, it doesn't need to be, blistering hot or desperately cold weather for people to die from exposure. It's the case that when they're out in the middle of nowhere and they are just getting drenched, or they're just in the sort of environment that the human body's not designed to go into.
Yeah,
that can play a major part and be quite debilitating.
It absolutely can. And those types of weather conditions are another thing that GMs can force onto the players. Treks through the desert, marches through the snow, venomous creatures, exposure. These are common things that, quite frankly, are tropes in adventures that a GM should never forget.
Yep.
But let's be fair. If you include those things in every session,
yeah, you're probably doing it wrong.
yeah, you're gonna have some really upset players. So how can we spice things up? What are some uncommon adventure tropes that are true tropes that a GM should never forget to use on occasion that can spice things up and still allow resilience to be rolled in a more regular fashion?
I think probably the one that gets not a lot of use, but we see it in all sorts of sci-fi settings. We see it in things like in computer games we're playing with, like Fallout and whatever else. Radiation. The old reactor is leaking during the fight, or the engine explodes, and then suddenly radiation is cascading throughout the ship. We hear it on Star Trek all the time. That the shields are holding back radiation, and there's going to be at a certain time it'll become lethal. What is that? What is radiation doing? How are they resisting that? It's resilience.
Exactly. And any setting that is basically modern or space opera or sci-fi, you can include radiation. You could conceivably include it in a fantasy setting, actually, if they're just around radioactive material. But that's very athematic. Technically you could, but it's very, very athematic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Another one I'm a huge fan of that doesn't get used enough, and really does apply to any setting you really can, is the idea of either polluted or toxic environments. When you get to something like the world of Android that explored in Shadow of the Beanstalk, or any type of modern or futuristic or sci-fi setting, pollution or toxic environments can be incredibly common.
Yep.
In sci-fi and space opera, especially, you have alien atmospheres.
Yep.
And inhospitable. You've had to crash land on a. Again, to bring up your Star Trek example, it's a demon class planet. It's a class M planet.
Yep.
Class M is the good
Class
one.
M is the good one, but that's all right.
Yeah. But they have these different classes. They have the Class D and the Class E, right? It's like, where that's really great. But even coming into fantasy, you can really bring that in fairly frequently. Whether they're, what a great set piece. They're fighting, around an erupting volcano in the evil wizard's lair, but there's all this ash and smoke they have to deal with, and you can. It's just fantasy radiation when you get down to it. It's all this other stuff. Another great one I've seen is environmental use. Maybe you're in a deep druidic forest or in the depths of a cave, and there's fungal spores everywhere. You can't stop coughing. There's never forget the flexibility of toxic or polluted environments as another way to spice up an encounter every other session or two.
I mean, there's even when you talk about a fantasy setting, how often do we see, and it's a general trope in all sorts of fantasy settings, are sewers. How often do people go into the sewers? And I mean, if you go back not all that long ago, the River Thames, if you fall into the River Thames, chances are you're probably not going to make it out very well because of how unclean it is. If you're looking at a 1800s sort of setting.
Oh, Holy, we got the Trinity River in Dallas. It's like that today.
Yeah, the Brisbane River
where'd you
is
get
much
that
better.
fish? The Trinity? And you touched it? You're not going to eat that, are you?
So you have them in everyday settings. So it's gone from just a athletics check to go from one side of the river to the next. It's like, sure, you can make it easily across, but you can make a resistance check, or resilience check. Sorry. So there are other ways which are quite interesting that you can throw in to break that norm of, it's clearly just going to be an athletics check or it's clearly going to be a survival check. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. The other one that doesn't get a lot of use, and we don't see a lot of information about it in the Genesys core rulebook, nor in Terranoth, nor in Shadow of the Beanstalk, is disease.
Yeah.
Now, this is something that, when it comes to sewers and whatever else, that disease does play a part. But there are some serious side effects to diseases that have long-term consequences that should not be just a single resilience check. That may take several resilience checks over several sessions or months of gameplay. That can lead on to other complexities, such as passing that disease on to other people. So, yeah.
Becoming a carrier and a contagion. And disease isn't commonly used because, honestly, it's not a very sexy thing.
No.
Well, sometimes it can be a sexy thing, or not a sexy thing in and of itself. It can be the result of a sexy thing. I'll put it that way. But what I mean by that is it's not very flashy, right?
No, yeah.
It's not very heroic. Okay. The big damn heroes, when they break into some place and save a village and party all night, when you leave, it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, you've caught the flu, or you've caught a nasty blood parasite or something like that. It has a lot of commonality in Dungeons and Dragons for fantasy players.
Yep.
But for heavy narrative heroic role playing, which is kind of where Genesys' seat is, it's not something you really consider.
No.
The heroes in Genesys, in such a narrative heavy thing, they're the ultimate badasses. They smoke and they never get cancer, right? They drink as much as they want, never have to worry about it's kind of a big damn heroic thing. So subvert some expectations, not frequently, but maybe at least once in a session or once in a campaign. Make disease a factor. And just from a GM standpoint, you can shock the players. It's like, put up a bounty notification, and it doesn't matter. This could be fantasy, it could be sci-fi, it could be modern, or space opera. Put up, there's a town that needs help. Dozens have died. They're fighting for their lives and they need help. And the party goes, oh well, we'll go help. And when they get there, instead of seeing a town being putting up barricades and defending itself against a raiding party of goblins or alien interlopers or pirates that are coming to savage them, what they're facing is a plague. And that's what they're fighting. And that's what's been killing people. And you can turn an entire party's expectation on its head and be like, oh, thank God you're here. Please, we help us seek a cure. We aren't learned. Please go out and help us. And it can really change the timbre of an adventure in a very stark way that could leave a very fun memory for your players, but at the same time also be a great excuse to introduce them to a communicable disease.
And what better way to motivate players to find a resolution to the problem by giving them the disease that they're trying to fight. So, it's you're removing that from, we're trying to do the right thing by helping the township. But suddenly Jeff, the barbarian, he suddenly picked up why the barbarian would get it. I don't know. I just picked that off the top of my head. But why Jeff the barbarian has suddenly picked up this heinous disease and why has he got pustules forming all over him? We need to really go and do something about that. So if there's some issues, if you're doing things on the fly and they're not wanting to engage in the adventure, why they wouldn't want to do that, I don't know. But if they weren't, that would be a really cool way of bringing them into the story and really drawing that out in them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, these are some common and uncommon ways a GM can bring resilience checks into more common use in their game by just presenting players with the appropriate scenarios. But Huli, what about the consequences here? Because I think the other thing the GM has to consider and really plan out ahead of time is what the consequences of all these varied failures on varied resilience checks for varied reasons are.
Indeed. So I guess when it comes to it, that some are easy to figure out, like a poison. And there are some really good examples in Terranoth when it comes to that type of thing. On how poison works. It's clear. It doesn't give much in the way of variety, but it basically says that when it comes to poison, you're making a hard resilience check, and that's pretty much it. But when you do that, you've really got to work out, well, what's going to happen if they fail?
Yeah.
Is there and in the in Terranoth, they say that a failed check will result in 3 wounds being suffered, and potentially, if there are more threat or despairs, that they might be forced to make another roll, or they may be forced to take a minor critical hit or a major critical hit.
Okay, well, so that's easy to figure out, though, and we got those rules laid out. What about some of the stuff we're building on the fly here? What about the effects of, extreme weather and failing that resilience check? What about failing that resilience check for radiation or pollution or toxic environments? What about failing it for disease?
So these are all things that you're going to need to be, looking at what the consequences are. And if you're writing your own adventure or running it from home, as you say, doing it on the fly, you need to be looking at what is going to be the failed result? Are there going to be further checks required? Are there going to be what's going to happen if it's a disease? What's going to happen if suddenly you've got this disease? Do you suddenly become a carrier for this disease? How does the disease work? There are a lot of things that you've got to really consider. You can also throw in things like, your typical impose a setback dice, or even, create that lasting damage. I know that there's a poison in one of the Age of Rebellion books that says that it's a permanent loss to wounds and strain threshold, and keeps on dropping down over a period of time until such time as the poison is flushed from the system or they get the antidote.
Yeah. Another good way to look at this, if you GMs out there are struggling with what to do, the core rulebook has an excellent set of tools that you can always have at your disposal to have as the results of a failed resilience check. And these tools are 4 status effects that begin on page 114 of the core rulebook. Yep. And those status effects are disoriented, staggered, immobilized, and dead. But in all seriousness, if you think about the progression of a radiation poisoning, or the progression of hypothermia or disease, what does that mean for the character mechanically? Well, honestly, the low grade version is going to be disoriented. They're going to be suffering setback dice to their checks. Yep. Okay. If things get really bad, they could become staggered, where they flat out can't perform actions. I mean, this is the weakling crawling on the floor, right? Yeah. You can barely move. From there you can move to flat out immobilization. All right, where you are immobilized. And then if things get super bad, it could or will kill you. The duration of these effects for something like radiation or extreme toxic environments or pollution, this could happen very fast. And, every time you fail your check, you could advance one stage further on that. Yep. Okay. A deep exposure to radiation is a good example for that. Okay. 4 rounds under incredibly intense radiation will kill you. Okay. It just will. It'll start with disorientation. It'll move to staggering. Then you will become immobilized as you pass out, and then you will die. Okay. But you could stave off that advancement by making successful checks. For something like a failure on disease, maybe somebody who's afflicted has to make one of these checks every few days. A resilience check every few days, maybe every week, okay, depending on how quickly the disease progresses. And again, if they fail the check, they're moved one step deeper down that ongoing status effect track of hell. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, probably a really good example of disease is what we see in The Walking Dead, that as soon as somebody basically gets bitten, you can survive for a while. And depending on how tough you are, they're making resilience checks all the time. But once you're bit, that's pretty much it. Unless you're chopping off your arm or leg or whatever else pretty much straight away, you're going to get it. And that's something that you probably should be, if you're going to be installing this sort of thing into your campaigns, you really need to be telling the players this right from the start, so that they're not suddenly, but I've spent all this time on this character and now it's been bitten. Well, you've set that expectation, as I've said at the start of this section. You've set that expectation that they are going to, this disease is something which will kill your character.
Yeah.
And you need to be dealing with that. So, how long you can survive without dying. And yes, there are examples of people who've actually managed to get better, but they are very, very few and far between.
They are, yes. Now, if that idea of using the 4 states of immobilizing status effects, of negative status effects, is too harsh for you, there is another method as well. One that I've used personally, and it added a great deal of dramatic tension to the game. And it was for disease specifically. So we use the disoriented status effect, okay? After that, as it progressed, and this was a very debilitating, it was a flesh-eating disease, the player had to roll critical injuries. Okay? Minimum of 46 or higher. So no matter what you rolled, the minimum is going to be 46, which is where, all the critical injuries have their own unique names, but 46 is the one where it starts to be like, okay, this is going to either increase the difficulty of doing something specific, or it's going to permanently hinder you in some key way until the critical injury is healed. Okay. And then it just gets worse and worse and worse, because as these critical injuries continue to stack as the disease progresses, you're adding plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, plus 10%, till eventually you're going to die, or you're going to have a limb wither away and be not used anymore, or you'll be crippled. Okay.
Yep.
Blinded. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, you've certainly got a large portion of things which are out there, and the critical hit tables is great. The conditions are amazing that you can use if you're building your own poisons or diseases or some other effect that is going to cause your players to be using their resilience to stave off the effects. But as players, what do we do as players? Chris?
Man, well, as players, you can suggest the use of resilience. All right. Never forget the ability to do that. This is a system of yes and. Okay. So there are plenty of ways, keeping within the rules as written. And I want to bring that up. It's a very important point, because in a little bit, we also are going to talk about some ways to maybe house rule some things to use resilience in some more creative ways. But, keeping things within the rules as written. Honestly, when you're making one of these checks, come up with some creative ways to use your results. That's the other key thing. And I love where my roots are with the Star Wars RPG. That system actually provides some further clarification and interesting suggestions on how you can be spending success and advantage and triumph when you're making a resilience check. Because that's the other thing too, is it's not just pass fail in this system. Don't treat resilience checks that way as well. From a player's standpoint, the GM's like, okay, yeah, he failed or he passed, so this bad thing happens or doesn't happen. From your perspective, you need to be interpreting your positive results appropriately. If you generate multiple successes, you can make an argument. Well, look, GM, I just generated 5 successes. Do I need to make another check next round, or can I carry this over? Because another common thing we see with this system is that more successes can often equate to a longer amount of time in terms of time-based skill checks. Yep. When you roll advantage, it's like, okay, the next check I make, GM, can I make that easier on myself? Can I reduce difficulty, or can I give myself a boost die on the next check? For a triumph, maybe I can if I've already suffered debilitating conditions, maybe I can just kick them off completely. Okay. None of these suggestions stop the adverse condition that I'm continually having to roll against, but they make it either easier for me in some form or fashion, or remove some of the impact that I've already suffered.
In a kind of a way, and this may be a stretch, but in a kind of a way, diseases become a skill challenge for a single PC to do over a period of time.
Absolutely.
So, it may be a case that you need to make 5 successes or 10 successes over the course of however long that this lasts, and you make one of these checks per day. So that's a different way of looking at doing a disease or a poison or something like that, and do it as a skill challenge instead.
Yeah. You talk about skill challenges, right?
Yeah.
Well, that is, at least for right now, a house rule. Since we're getting into that, I think we probably have a couple of interesting suggestions for some GMs and players who really want to pump resilience up into high territory and make it a much more useful skill. These are a couple ways that I can't speak to you, Hooli, but I know the things that we're going to be talking about, at least the first 2, I have done in my games sometimes and sometimes not. But what we're going to present you with are very balanced solutions that we've found to work, at least in our games at home.
Yeah, absolutely. So our first one would be, it's a bit of a modification to the ruling that we see for natural healing, but it's certainly something that can get your PCs up quicker then, as you said before, they are big damn heroes.
Yes.
So let them heal a little bit quicker. If we see Arnie get injured in combat in a movie, we don't sort of see him having to rest up for a week unless it's extreme circumstances, from major injuries there, and they don't always have a medico on hand to fix up the problem. So if we want to really sort of bolster that up a little bit more and make critical injuries not necessarily as big a problem as what they can seem in the longer term, you can roll that into a single resilience check at the difficulty of the critical injury, within a shorter period of time. Generally speaking, as I said before, with a night's natural rest, instead of one piddly wound healed, you would roll the resilience, with the same difficulty as the critical wound healing, which is on table 16-11, which is on page 116 of the core rulebook. If your current wounds equal or less than half your threshold, it's 1 purple. Current wounds greater than half your threshold, average for 2 purple. And the current your current wounds exceed the threshold, it becomes a hard. So you heal a number of wounds equal to your uncancelled successes on the roll to a minimum of 1, no matter what. This also means that it's harder to heal more naturally if you're really beaten up, which it is. Wound effects on the body are going to be cumulative after all.
This is true. And this is the thing I've found extreme success with in fantasy settings, because honestly, and this has been another common player complaint as well. If you don't have access to painkillers, okay, or whatever their equivalent is in your setting, I mean, you're hosed. I mean, even a character with 500 earned XP, they're healing 1 wound a night. That's it. Okay, and so if I've got a threshold of 22. And I'm actually at my threshold or above my threshold, I mean, what? That's a month.
Yeah.
That's a month to heal.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen very often, but it's one of those things that this can really bring resilience to the forefront. And, whereas, as Hooli said, that the core rules only allow for resilience and healing when you're trying to heal a critical injury naturally, and it takes like 1 week of rest, I think, you can, as you said, speed that up. And you can also allow them to make these rolls nightly to heal their wounds faster. As you said, Hooli, depending on where they are with their wounds in relation to their threshold.
Yeah. If people find it a hard pill to swallow, because, there are a lot of people out there who like to stick to the rules as written because the expectations are set right from the start as soon as they buy the book, is then fine. Flip a story point, and, that's as rules as written, the story points break the rules. So Absolutely. Say, okay, well, you're going to be resting up for a night. Spin a story point, and I'll allow this to happen. It certainly makes it a much easier pill for them to swallow then, rather than going through the drama of, but the rules say this. Well, sure, if you want to run a boring campaign, that's fine. But, but look, in defense of that, it may be a case that you want them to have the downside for a month. You want the time to pass because you want some sort of an event to occur when they go, once they've recovered from their injuries and they go back to the town. Sure, stuff like that. But if you wanting the action to keep on moving and the story to constantly be progressing,
and you want to showcase resilience a little more,
exactly right. That this is basically what you would do.
Yeah. So this is our first suggested house rule, is to allow for resilience rolling to heal faster naturally. Now the second one that I'm a huge fan of, and it's even almost kind of pseudo raw, but it's not raw.
Yep.
Is allow resilience to take the place of athletics under certain circumstances. Specifically with what I would term feats of endurance.
Right.
Okay. So, no, a resilience check should not allow you to break open a steel door with your bare hands or to lift a heavy rock. That's athletics, okay?
Yep.
But if you're climbing a mountain, okay, or hanging from your fingertips by a narrow ledge, I mean, yeah, that could be athletics. But why not resilience? I mean, as any rock climber can tell you, it's. I mean, yeah, your strength's important, but it's about your endurance more than anything else. Okay, and speaking on that, a foot race could easily be made. A check for a foot race could easily be made with a resilience check, especially if it's a marathon.
Yeah. Indeed.
In fact, if it was a marathon, I mean, I would straight up be like, I don't need athletics. I need resilience from you.
Exactly right. Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that as you're thinking about, feats of brawny goodness that are, where you could reasonably substitute resilience, allow it.
Well, look, one thing, just thinking out loud here, that one of the things that I immediately think of is to try to bring in a skill challenge, because I love that mechanism. And if you're a player and you're going from one end to a dungeon to the next or something like that, or you're trying to make your way through, why not suggest to your GM, well, maybe there was a portcullis that was there, and I needed to hold it open to allow my friends to get through. Can I make a resilience check? That's a brilliant way of doing it, because it is a feat of endurance to be able to hold up this massive thing. It's not a matter of lifting it for the first place. It's a matter of that you've given that description that you're holding it up in this dramatic fashion, screaming out like Arnie or whatever else, and you do it much better than me. But the fact is that you're suggesting that you're adding that narrative to the storyline that would, for me, that'd be definitely a resilience check. No problem at all.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's some suggestions as far as house ruling. Final thoughts? Look, I can't stipulate enough about these diseases, because I know that we've spoken about diseases a lot during this particular thing, because it is something that doesn't come up very often, and I think that it's a unique thing that you need to really look at. So realistically, just go back to what we've already spoken about. What effects this has on the affected character. What are some of the secondary effects that there's going to have? You might want to be considering setback dice, permanent loss of strain injury, permanent loss of wounds, and those conditions that we've mentioned to you as well. And look, there are probably going to be other conditions as well. You mentioned blindness before. Which could,
and so it's on the crit table. Yeah, that's why.
Yeah, so look at the crit table as a bit of an idea of what sort of things can go horribly, horribly wrong. And you want to know why this system is even so much more awesome than we already know it to be? Yes, why?
How easy should it be to heal a disease, or how easy should the resilience check be to overcome a disease?
Yep.
Start at the effect.
Yes.
Okay, so if the effect of the disease the character is currently experiencing equates to a crit on that crit chart,
yep,
use the difficulty for the crit.
Exactly.
Use the difficulty for the crit. Okay. That's also another reason that we also like suggesting, looking at the crit chart for effects, because at that point you have a balanced difficulty tied to that severity of effect, a difficulty to overcome it, a difficulty to resist it, or a difficulty to heal it.
Yep. Exactly. And I think that's a really good way to finish that off.
Well, all right. Now that we've talking about that, I think we should talking about something else. I think, Mr. Hooley, it's time that we should pump the bellows and heat things up as we open the furnace doors and talking to somebody I cannot wait to talk to.
I know.
The Furnace.
And welcome to The Furnace, the segment where we take a deep dive into a topic concerning custom creations using the Genesys role-playing game. And tonight we're going to expand our horizons with a topic that is vastly important, not just for those creating content for the Genesys Foundry, of course, but for any GM or writer who is crafting exciting things to simply run on their own tables. And this is strong and memorable adventure seeds and set pieces.
That's right. Now, most GMs and authors think about the complexities of module creation and adventure crafting, but taking that learning and execution to a more basic and frankly, more versatile and useful level is what we are going to be talking about tonight. We are talking about the creation of pre-made, pre-written, well-designed adventure seeds for sessions and set pieces for player encounters.
Indeed. Now, creating the skeleton or inspiration for solid adventures, as well as the ins and outs of specific memorable encounters, serve to provide amazing content in an RPG supplement. But it also can hone your adventures at the home game level, giving the GM a stable or ready-to-go ideas that will excite their players, cut down prep time, and let GMs be ready to be awesome at a moment's notice. Even on the Diceball podcast, I created an episodic adventure chart to address this issue and help GMs to make exciting scenarios and stories for their players. But it's more than just a chart. There are some very helpful hints, tips and tricks that can help you make the most of your gaming time. And to that end, we thought it best to bring onto the show a very special guest to help us tackle this conundrum of epic proportions, a true expert, shall we say.
Joining us tonight is a man who is a literal living legend in the RPG industry, a freelance writer and cartographer who's been working since the early 90s. He has been a tour de force whose credits we cannot begin to do justice to. He has been a contributing author and a cartographer on scores of RPG and minis products for multiple publishers, including work on D&D, Savage Worlds, Call of Cthulhu, D20 Modern, Numenera, every version of a Star Wars RPG that has ever been produced, from West End Games to Wizards of the Coast to Fantasy Flight Games, and of course, Genesys. Having worked on roughly 30 published products for Fantasy Flight Games, from a Genesys standpoint, not only was he a contributing author to the core rulebook, but also for Shadow of the Beanstalk and the forthcoming Expanded Player's Guide and Keyforge campaign setting. And, let's not forget, was one of the launch authors for the Genesys Foundry, contributing the Android adventure module Power Play and the brilliant Instant Adversaries. He's also published Electrum and Mithril best-selling D&D adventures for the DMs Guild. He has been a guest of mine on the Order 66 podcast a total of 17 times, has been one of our guests of honor at Gamer Nation Con. A brilliant author, perhaps most lauded for his exceptional work in crafting adventures. He is also the recipient of numerous RPG Industry Design and Product Award nominations and wins. We are proud to welcome, for the first time to the Forge podcast, our friend, Mr. Sterling Hershey.
Sterling, it's wonderful to talk to you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Thanks for having me on. It's always fun to talk to you guys.
Well, Sterling, we are eager to leverage your expertise to discuss the topic of adventure seed and set piece creation. But for those Forge podcast listeners and Genesys fans who may be meeting you for the first time, if it's okay, we'd love to spend just a couple minutes kind of getting to know you a bit better.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So now we've discussed your gaming experience in what Chris was saying before. Which is quite vast to say the least. So can you tell us a little bit about your gaming history and work and where it all started and things like that?
Sure. So I guess from a gaming standpoint, I started playing D&D like very, very late 70s. Picked up and played a number of other RPGs through the years through that time. But then got into the Star Wars RPG. Played a little bit in high school, but then really got into it more in college when some friends decided that I needed to be running it. And so from a freelance standpoint, I got started writing RPGA modules back when RPGA was around. I wrote a couple of Star Wars adventures for them, Milk Run and Defection. And Milk Run got picked up and run in there. Well, got picked up for the Gen Con adventure that following year, which meant it was the official RPGA Star Wars adventure, and I ran it like 6 or 7 times. It is one of many people running it. And then that got picked up and run in Polyhedron magazine, which was the RPGA's, they call it a newzine, I think, but basically a small magazine.
Right.
And in the meantime, I'd already sent a proposal into West End Games to do a book on Rebel bases, and I was studying to be an architect at the time, and thought that'd be fun to do. And they said, "Thank you. We'll hold on to this, but not right now." And then after, but I met some of them at Gen Con, and including the line editor, Bill Smith, and he then, after it was published in the RPGA magazine, and I was trying to get some writer's guidelines from them again because I didn't have them with me. I was out of the country, and they said, "Well, yeah, we can send them to you, but we also have a proposal for you," which turned into my first product, Flashpoint Brack Sector. So from there, they liked what I was doing. They were very, very helpful in the my early days, and I became semi-regular with them. And then they went bankrupt. But after that, I had a little bit of a pause while Wizards of the Coast didn't use freelancers early on. They did pretty much all of it in-house. But Star Wars Gamer Magazine came along, and then I got another shot at doing some things with them. And then, again, once I then the minis game came along, and so there was I wrote a lot of minis scenarios, and then a lot of that led into stuff with Saga Edition being in the right place at the right time, and then of course Fantasy Flight. And then there was I did write some D&D in there too. I wrote a number of 4th edition adventures and for Dungeon, and some articles for Dragon, usually based around like past history of earlier D&D products, or stories rather, not the products themselves.
Wow.
My favorite anecdote that you told me once is, a lot of people don't know that you went to, was it college? You went to college with Jim Butcher?
No, I actually went to high school.
You went to high school with Jim Butcher. Yep. The most of our listeners probably know him as the author of the Dresden Files, among many other things. And you guys used to play Cthulhu RPGs together?
So in high school, it would have been D&D and Warhammer Fantasy. And later on, in the early 2000s, a mutual friend of ours was running a Cthulhu game that we played in.
I think that's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's always been very surreal to see his books and how his career has gone over the years. Especially the first time finding his books on like the store shelves in Barnes and Noble, and I was like, wait a second. I was like, is that really? I picked it up and looked at the picture, and sure it was. Sure enough, it was.
I mean, they made a TV series. It only lasted a season, but they made a TV series. People don't remember that. With Paul Blackthorne, it was good.
Yep.
Yep. Oh, that's absolutely hilarious. So, okay, you've been writing for decades. Okay, you've been playing twice as long, because this is Genesis, and that's really the focus of this particular show. And obviously, as one of the initial authors who really helped contribute not just to the Genesis system and help make it what it is, but as one of the original authors who also helped contribute to the first iteration of the narrative dice system with Star Wars, you more than many others are very close to this system. And considering that, with your RPG experience, what is your first love of Genesis? And what I mean is, in other words, what setting or theme do you most enjoy in this system when you get the chance to run or play?
It's kind of funny because I ran a fair amount of Terranoth back during the playtest of that stuff. I didn't actually work on the books, and that was interesting just because I don't run a lot of other fantasy besides D&D. But I think as far as setting is concerned, I really like Android, and I wasn't into it very much before sort of the opportunity came about to work on the book. My wife had the Android card game, and and I'd seen the Worlds of Android book and that sort of thing. But once I really got into sort of what they were doing with their history and so forth and their setting, I really liked that sort of harder sci-fi setting. So I find that one very interesting. When I'm looking through the different themes and so forth, I haven't really had a chance to run a lot of the different themes. I did work on the tones, and but so it was fun, like at Gen Con, to play in Phil's Starcana game, just to see his take on the sort of sci-fi magic kind of setting. And I have made a couple of settings that I haven't really done anything with, just more out of experimentation. Not spending a ton of time on them, but just working through the details, and they were also sci-fi related. I guess I tend to go towards the sci-fi side of things.
Well, it's not as though you don't have much in the way of experience in that realm.
Yeah, that's true. That's although I will have to say that the working with the Keyforge setting, which of course I can't talk about, that was a lot of fun, because and you've seen the Keyforge card game, so it's if you've seen the card game, all these different wild factions and how do they operate together, how does that work, and then they've also got fiction already available in the like rule books and things like that. So getting in and work, I do like these sort of weird settings, so like Numenera or Gamma World. I have a lot of fun with those kind of things, because for whatever reason, I feel like I've got a lot more. If I get a fun idea just at that moment, I can run with it, and it's a weird setting, so these odd things can happen, just especially with Numenera. And so Keyforge feels like that to me in many ways. So I'll look forward to running that at some conventions.
It's certainly wacky. There is no two ways about that.
I am so excited for Keyforge. It's gonna be weird. We were talking about on a recent episode of this show that my 9-year-old daughter actually asked me if she came home from school saying that her friends at school were playing this game called Keyforge. She wanted to play, and I'm like, "You're kidding! Awesome! Daddy has a starter set. Come on!" So
Keyforge. We actually gave a starter set to some of the relatives, that some kids that they'd never seen it before, and started playing it, and then immediately they're like, "Oh yeah, we want to keep playing this." So that was fun. It just to be able to sort of just out of the blue give it to them and say, "Hey, here's a fun game."
All right, so Sterling, we'd very much like to dive into our to the topic at hand. Though we've got a few outline topics for discussion. We'd very much like to keep it a bit of a free form conversation, going where we may on this topic of Adventure Seed and set piece crafting. Does that sound like a plan?
Sounds good.
Awesome.
Excellent. So, all right. Before we get into this discussion, Holy, a lot of our listeners may be wondering, adventure seeds, set pieces, what are we talking about? Indeed.
So basically, when it comes to, adventure seeds and set pieces, we see a lot of these in, especially more so with Legend of the Five Rings that I found.
Yeah.
But we also do see them in Star Wars adventures and supplements as well. And it's the rise of the popularity of these adventure seeds in published products, which it's kind of a way to drop without giving too much information, so that the GM has a lot more scope to play with, that they can just dump these straight into their adventures and start playing with a key idea of this is where it starts, this is the body of the adventure, and this is how it can resolve. So that's basically what we talk about when we talk about adventure seeds. But what about set pieces, Chris?
Well, set pieces are basically generic pre-designed encounters, and often if we look at especially what the styles of adventure seeds that Fantasy Flight has published in its various products, they will not always, but sometimes often include a set piece or two as a part of that, sort of key encounters or encapsulated encounters that are kind of a subset of an adventure seed. And there is that. But when we talk about this difference, Hooli, between this, we're seeing more and more adventure seeds. And Sterling, I'd be very interested to get your take on this, because there are adventure seeds and there are modules, full adventure modules, and there seem to be two very different things for two very different needs. I mean, a full-on adventure module, I mean, you can just, it's got everything you need. There's no work you need to do outside of prepping yourself and reading it. But an adventure seed has a very different place. It's designed to sort of, I don't know, give the bones of an adventure idea, maybe even for a session instead of an entire campaign, or multiple sessions, which a module can encompass.
Yes, yes, that's right. Yeah, so these adventure seeds, there's a couple of things we often do with those. One is that, it's an idea for an adventure, but specifically in a lot of the FFG products, we're trying to highlight something specific about maybe a location or an idea, but usually like specific planets might have adventure seeds, and so we'll try and highlight whatever makes that planet special or a feature that would be fun to have an adventure in. So there's sort of that sort of demonstration aspect to it, but then there's also, of course, coming up with enough information that the GM can make an adventure, or at the very least a session out of that particular idea. And then we'll give the general idea of it. We'll say, here's the location, here are the things that should happen. But we'll leave a lot open to the game master to adapt to their own game. And that's one thing everyone does is take ideas you get from one adventure and maybe use them. And if you don't use the whole adventure, you use part of this idea in your own adventure. So the seeds work in that way very well.
Very aptly named. It's a seed. Having it grow into various things. So, there are a lot of podcasts that have been done around adventure design. For Pete's sake, Sterling, we even had you on the Order 66 podcast a very long time ago, where Sam Witwer also joined us. I don't know if you even recall that, and we built it live on the air.
Yeah, I remember.
It was a really fun episode. And, building a long-term adventure and writing a full module, I mean, these are big topics that I know we're going to get into detail on, but when we talk about especially content that we're seeing for the Foundry, and people are developing their own Genesis materials and their own Genesis settings, going whole hog with a module is always a wise idea. And we've seen that there tends to be a very strong correlation between the success of custom settings that are followed very quickly or coterminously by a module, so people can run it immediately. But including set pieces in your setting creation seems to be a good little stopgap measure to, as you said, what would you say, impart certain themes or locations or very specific ideas without having to have a fully prescribed module or adventure.
Yeah, it's a good way to sell different ideas about your whatever it is that makes your setting special or interesting or fun. And when especially if you don't have the word, and now these being PDFs, word count may or may not be as big of an issue for people, but whether it's word count or just time to develop these items. But since they're all role-playing games, it's good to have a lot of any way you can get more adventure or encounter ideas into a product, the better it tends to be, in my opinion. So like I've had people tell me, stuff that I've written, they're like, oh, I get so many ideas just out of reading this one paragraph. And that's the idea, is to feed in all these potential, show the potential of what could happen in the game.
I mean, how many times have you come across someone who said, I've read a line, and they've blown it up just from that one line of text from some piece of fluff somewhere to be this huge overarching campaign?
Or story prompts that people use for some fiction writing or for writing exercises.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That's a great analogy. Yeah.
Because that's something that I've noticed, especially with Shadow of the Beanstalk, is that it doesn't have a lot of adventure seeds. There's an entire section in the back, which I believe that friend of the podcast, Keith Capel, wrote, that talks about, creating those adventures using that sort of the hook, the twist and the resolution sort of method. But there's a lot of...
they've got an adventure builder in the back.
Yep. But there's a lot of sections that are in the book spread throughout, which sort of tells a little bit about the world, or a particular character and whatever else. So it's not just, you don't have to have a structured sort of format, I guess. It can be just here's a snippet of something that is going on in the world, just to give that idea, and players and GMs can then start to really look at what the ins and outs of that, and that might generate some ideas, and then obviously they can research that area and expand it out.
Well, and I know I mentioned locations, but I mean another thing to definitely look at are different social or combat situations or specific characters. If you want to highlight a specific NPC and give people an idea of, hey, what does this person do? How do they operate? An adventure seed can help do that. But as you said, it doesn't have to be a formal. Here's an adventure idea. Here's what you can do with the idea. It can just be the description of the NPC. Might have some very interesting things written into it, hopefully, and some of them might be open-ended enough to let the GM look at it and go, hey, okay, I can take this idea that this character does this one certain thing, and how would that interact with my players, and then go from there.
Okay, so this brings up a really good question, and when we talk about the process of adventure seed creations, where does a writer start, and how deep do you ultimately want to get in an adventure seed? So, I mean, so two questions. First thing is where do you start, and what's your end goal here? What's that dividing line between a seed and a mini module, basically?
Yeah, and that can be kind of fun to work out. When does a seed become an encounter or an adventure or a module or full on module? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of times where you might get an idea for a full on entire module, but if you try and boil it down into a couple of paragraphs, it doesn't really. There's not enough information really there. So then you got to kind of pick a couple of highlighted or areas that you can focus on. In terms of where do you start, I mean, they're so short that outlining, I'm not sure I'd do that exactly. Although I guess that's not quite true. When I think of outline, I think of something much sort of more detailed. But when we are developing outlines and things for products with Fantasy Flight, because that's one of the first steps we often have to do, we can at least write a few sentences about, hey, this is the really basic idea. And as far as how deep do you go, if it's an adventure seed, you're probably not putting in things like really encounter-specific mechanics. Mm-hmm. You might mention, if you're having if you're having a fight over a ravine, for instance, or maybe the ravine is flooding. Okay, you can get away with saying, hey, the floodwaters come through at this one point, and you're not getting in there and saying, here are the skill checks you have to do to avoid the flood. Here's the damage the flood does. You kind of leave those details to the GM. You might mention a little bit. Depends on if you're trying to make a seed that's an example of a mechanic, then maybe you would include those. Yeah. But for the most part, you don't get generally too deep into the actual mechanics of it. You want to keep more on the story, overall story level.
Mm. Because it's certainly more sort of high level more than it is to get into the minutiae of the situation that you're going to be dealing with.
Yes. Yeah, because usually you don't have the space to put it in the first place, and second place, that's not really the... If you're going to do that, you may as well go write the encounter or the adventure.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Because I know that when I did the episodic adventure chart, the sort of suggestion that I've always had is that you just do a sentence. You don't do anything more than that. And that's just to give you a bit of an idea of where you're going to go. So, doing any more than that, as you say, you might as well be starting to, go down the path of writing the entire adventure.
Yeah, and it goes back to that writing prompt idea we were talking about a little bit ago.
That's a good way to think about it. And so, okay, then let's talk about that content. What, for somebody who's never written before, and whether they're looking to create adventure seeds in a product that they plan to publish, or whether they're simply, quite frankly, being a smart GM, because I'm going to be perfectly blunt, having these kinds of adventure seeds in your game Bible or your campaign notebook for yourself, for your own game, GMs out there, is a piece of incredible wisdom that will serve you. So you will pull things out of your butt that you wrote years ago when you're stumped for ideas and need something. Yep. So in either of those scenarios, what content should you include with that level of detail? I mean, story beats, critical decision points, outcomes. What's the best case scenario look like? What's the good use case, basically?
One thing is also good about writing these seeds is if you are creating a brand new setting, it's also a great way for you to brainstorm ideas for what else can your setting do? How far can it go? What's, it makes you work through different scenarios when you start looking at your different settings or your different characters or settings or mechanics. So in terms of what it should include, it should story beats. Story beats is an interesting thing, but just because whenever I hear the term story beat, it's just not a term that I've ever really used that much of. I know what people mean by it, and I know writers, for TV shows or whatever, get into doing that. That's not how I tend to think of them.
Okay.
So, but I come, I guess, a little. I don't want to say a little more organically, maybe. I don't know. I don't usually go in and say, I want the characters to be very sad at this point or very frightened at this point. I might do that in an adventure, but I just don't tend to think of hitting certain beats in stories. That sounds a little more mechanical, or I guess in its worst case, formulaic than what I tend to think of. I may still do that. I just don't think of it in that term. But if you have an idea though that you want to highlight, that's probably a good place to start. Critical decision points, you should definitely have a few of those, and definitely you need to give the GM ideas of what to do with possible outcomes. You can't, obviously, you don't know how they're going to develop the seed, but there should at least be a couple of possible outcomes and where they might lead, because that's the next thing. It's like, okay, you have the seed, you have this adventure. Well, where does the adventure go from there? If you can include just a little bit of a clue as to what other adventure types or other encounters this could lead into, it's handy to be able to include that. NPCs and encounters. NPCs definitely. Unless it's purely some sort of adventure based around surviving a specific environment. Even then, you probably have creatures.
Right.
So some key NPCs. You don't necessarily have to include the stats, although again, if you're creating your own setting, you can certainly refer to stats you've already created. And if you've got a creature index or other NPCs you've created, you can certainly refer to those and probably should. But you don't have to include them right there in the adventure seed unless you do it as maybe as a sidebar or something, if it's something really special.
This is good advice. And it's interesting to hear you talk about, the idea of getting less prescriptive, where you're moving towards a more generic or open way, getting away from the concept of something like story beats, so to speak. So I really do like that. And in that same vein, and talking about tone or theme or even setting, which we've kind of been dancing around that idea. From your perspective, how focused to a particular setting or theme should an adventure seed be? Is too generic a bad idea? Should you really target it towards a specific product or a specific thing?
Yeah, I think you should target it. I know people have done products of 100 adventure ideas or whatever it is,
Right.
which can be useful. But if you're creating your own setting, you definitely want them to be focused on things that your setting does well and people have fun doing.
Because I think the point that you made before about that setting it, attaching it to either an NPC or a particular location makes the most sense, so that you can then highlight things that may not necessarily be mechanical, but you want it to be useful for the reader.
Yes.
Because one of the things that, and I know that I go back to L5R because I've obviously had a lot to do with it, being, doing some freelance for FFG in that realm. But in their book, Emerald Empire, they've started to do these adventure seeds, which is a great way of doing it. And I think that Star Wars has done it as well in its modules, and resource material, is that they have a clearly defined layout, which has the hook, the rising action, and then the climax of the scenario. They're not huge areas either. They're only probably around about 250 to 300 words, but they're quite clear without being too, without covering every single little piece of whether it be mechanical or whatever else. That I think that, and in this particular book, they've done it for both NPCs and people, as well as locations, and it works really, really well to give that a little bit more of usefulness to the GM.
That was another question I had. Is your length?
Yeah.
How long should a good adventure seed be? Are you shooting? Are you shooting for a couple hundred words? A single page, a 2-page split. But I mean, I guess goes back down to yeah.
Yeah, I would. I mean, for an adventure seed, I would probably target a few paragraphs at most. I mean, you could get away with even just a couple of paragraphs. But I wouldn't. If you're starting to get to a page long, then you're really getting more into. Well, I guess it could be that.
It could be, but but you're getting into set piece territory at that point.
Yeah, there you go. Yep.
where you're really defining. Okay, here's some serious detail. And I think there's a place for both, and we've seen them both in. I go to Star Wars as a prime example, where I've seen where we have honest to goodness adventure seeds where you can fit 5, 6, 7 on a page, and then you've got 2-page splats of basic set pieces that really tend to revolve around a specific scenario or a specific NPC and get into a little more detail, and are a little less generic, a little more prescriptive.
Yes, and my books are just a little too far away from me here, but the one of the adventures I did, or adventure ideas I did for Star Wars, it was built around this idea of the PCs basically taking over a space station right under the nose of the Empire, and then getting conning the local government into basically helping them rebuild it because it was like damage in the Clone Wars or something like that, and then using that rebuilt station to ambush an Imperial fleet later on. But to do that, there's several. That's gets into a little bit longer piece where you're into an entire adventure, but you're highlighting each section almost becomes its own seed basically for that section of the adventure. Or in this case, I think it was actually more of a campaign idea. So each seed was represented sort of each part of that of that campaign. So it would highlight, what sort of events would happen in each of these sections of the adventure.
That's a really unique way of doing it. So that basically you setting up your campaign or mini campaign of 3 or 4 sessions or adventures, but you're just treating them as an adventure seed for each of that area of the overall campaign. That's one way that you could, if you were creating your own setting or whatever else, that you had a number of different adventure seeds throughout the adventure or the setting that you're doing that can then form this greater story. That's really unique. I like that idea.
And from a sort of creator standpoint, there's, I get a lot of ideas when I'm writing. I get a lot of ideas when I'm working on these products, and there's no way that I'll ever be able to run them all. So it's fun to get to these ideas out there, and even if they're not fully detailed, at least say, hey, here's a cool adventure idea, here's a cool campaign idea, here's a framework that you can start with to get you going, and then have at it.
Right. And that's the heart of this. And ultimately, when we talk about the usefulness of developing adventure seeds on your own, whether you're going to publish them or whether you're just going to use them in their own games, that coupled with true, seed creation and set piece creation it's that spark to the creativity. It's like lighting a stick of dynamite. When you're totally caved in and you're blocked. At least for me as a GM, it's one of those things that, when I'm struggling to write or to come up with something new, taking a few glimpses at those concepts that I haven't looked at in a long time, it just really sparks movement, and becomes this incredibly versatile resource. And and I guess this is the side effect of our conversation. I'm encouraging all of you to go out there and write these. Yes, that's amazing. We're talking about that, but listen, if you're just a GM, you need to be using these. Like much deeper than that. You just need to be using them at a much higher level. Your games will improve. You will find yourself to be a more responsive game master as a result. So,
Chris, can we talk a little bit more about, just very quickly on that topic, of how people can actually lay that out? Is there a process in place that we can impart to our listeners that will allow people to, not just go, okay, I've got this adventure idea and just write that down in a couple of paragraphs? Can we provide them with a bit of more of a structured format for those people who are fairly new to the game, or are really sort of fairly new to getting their ideas that they have down on paper? Yeah.
And this actually bleeds wholly into a conversation on honest to goodness set pieces.
Yeah, it does.
Expanding this generic adventure seed idea into something much larger, because a set piece for me is a great place to start. An adventure seed typically encapsulates a session, whereas a set piece is typically an encounter. Okay, there's a cool encounter, and in my gaming career, I've kept, in Star Wars, we always refer to it as the GM holocron, okay? Mm-hmm. Or your GM notebook, your game Bible, whatever it is, where I would just keep it with me and jot things down. I'd devote a full page to a set piece whenever it came up. The colorful location. Okay, key location. What's the size? What's the scale of the location? What are the terrain? What are the features? Going so far as to noting that. And even in contrast to the simplicity of Adventure Seed that Sterling brought up before, even potentially saying, okay, look, this is the difficulty for navigating this terrain or this particular hazard. Actually noting that. And then, of course, what are the threats? What are the NPCs? Whereas an adventure seed is about those decision points, a set piece is a fleshed out decision point in singular. Okay, whether it's decision based or encounter based. The key thing for me is taking the time to note all these things, and just jot them down in a somewhat prescriptive way. But there's, at least in my experience, good things to do for this and bad things to do for this. And if you look at some of the really good, dual page splats that have been published on at least what I call set pieces, there's common things they note, and really good ones. The kicker for me, Hooli, is having either multiple ways or a unique way to resolve the situation or the encounter that does not necessarily rely on kill all the bad guys.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of what's worked for me, and especially because with this particular system, it's such a narrative heavy system, and the narrative dice, what they impart onto how everything works for this. This is actually, I mean, I actually do not recommend what I do to everyone else. I would love to get your thoughts and Sterling's thoughts on this, because from my perspective, I tend to, in my home games especially, I get way too detailed for my own notes. And what I mean is I engage in a behavior I do not wish to promulgate. And that behavior is that I tend to account for about 17 potential scenarios.
Right.
You know, what if this happens? Well, what if that happens? Well, what if this happens? Well, then this. Well, what if that? Well, then you do this. Well, what if this? Then you do that. I mean, literally, it's almost like one step shy of developing a flow chart, because I've been playing this game long enough and running it long enough that I know a single triumph or a despair will take everything I've planned and just shove it in the garbage can, right?
Yes.
So how do you manage that and still keep the set piece intact? I would love to get Sterling's thoughts and your thoughts on this, because this, you know, the narrative dice system makes things go sideways when it comes to adventure seeds, set pieces, or hell, Sterling, even full-on module creation. How do you handle that? How do you plan for that?
Well, I mean, with the set pieces, because obviously with big adventures and modules, the set pieces are part of the deal. And you're dependent on the GM to revise that as needed for their games. So sometimes you'll see advice in there for, hey, if things really go wrong, here's a way to bring that on track. We don't tend to spend a lot of word count on that, because we really want to focus on, well, we don't have that much word count. And if you have a whole bunch of extra scenario idea or extra ideas that might be carried out, you don't know that the GM will be able to refer back to it that quickly or whatever. It's kind of different when it's your home game, because you generally know what you wrote or remember what you wrote, and so you know where to go look when something goes awry. So when I'm writing, like, I was just thinking, I don't want to give anything away. I was thinking it's like the end of some of the ending encounters in Ghosts of Dathomir, which is for the Star Wars Force and Destiny game. There's some elements in there that really are kind of going from one set piece to another, and then you're dependent on, again, the GM because it's that adventure has a lot of exploration in it. You're sort of expected that the GM can bridge over and adapt the situation as they roll into the next one. So I guess I don't spend a ton of time writing alternate. I try to focus on the one that seems like is the most fun and I like the best. And then if something, and you're right, a triumph or a despair can throw things out of whack a little bit, or maybe a lot. But a little bit of that is also if you're as the GM giving out the results of despairs or triumphs as opposed to your players. And I know that's sometimes it's one, sometimes the other. But if you're the one in control of that a little bit, you can try and focus those on elements that are still fun but aren't going to derail your set piece, at least not in the beginning. The further you get into the set piece, the less I worry about that. And the other thing I do is if there's something cool in the set piece, I'm going to want to try and have that happen like first thing or very early in the encounter, so that it gets a chance to happen without it getting derailed. Because that's another thing with adventures that I've started to try and do too, is that how many times have you been running an adventure at a convention and people are having so much fun at the early part of the adventure, you never quite get to the cool battle scene at the end or whatever it is.
Right.
So what I've tried to do is move some of those elements earlier into the in the adventure. Have some of those things happen sooner. That way, I know that they will. First of all, I'll know that they'll get to see them and play through them and have fun with them. But also, is less chance of the story getting away from those pieces just by evolving.
That's a really interesting thought. You start off with the Big Bang instead of leading up to it, which is honestly that's the traditional session right there. Is you lead up to the Big Bang. You always start. Yes, well, you've met in the tavern. It's the Rusty Nail, and you're here again. And
yes,
yeah, it's a very intriguing idea. And having run similar adventures like that, I can attest that starting sort of, for lack of a better term, in media res, is also a great way to, especially at a convention, shove a very potentially disparate group of players who don't know each other right into the fire. So that's a very intriguing suggestion, Sterling.
And of course, in media res was West End Games, Star Wars. That was a big element of how they approached adventure design, and so of course I've kept that all along.
One thing that I'd like to mention that you just touched base on, Sterling, and I think that it's really great advice for anybody who is designing modules for like the larger scope as opposed to what we're talking about today. But it's certainly a nugget worth mentioning, is that when you're the GM, you're obviously in charge of where threat and despair go. So when you're writing these adventures, focus on that. Don't necessarily worry too much about triumphs and advantages and how they can be spent. Look at what the GM has control of and focus on that rather than rather than doing what Chris is suggesting, and going sort of like 17 different options that you can go to.
Oh, that's my point. I'm not suggesting.
Oh, you're not doing that, right?
I'm saying don't do that.
Right.
That's what I've done in the past, especially when I first started years ago trying to get a handle on this system. So I was, it's not something I encourage. So what you guys are suggesting, no, those are the appropriate methods.
Yeah. So focusing on those where the despair where the despairs can be used in this particular encounter or this particular scenario, as well as threat, is fantastic advice, I think.
Yeah, and the other thing is if you give some ideas in your, I know I said don't get into too many mechanics, but if you do have an idea for, hey, a despair in this situation has this effect, or a triumph in this situation can spur this effect, then you're building it in a little bit more. At least you're building at least a couple of elements in that, assuming they make sense for the situation, can help keep your set piece on track instead of maybe derailing it.
Yeah. I guess the point that I'm making is that with what you've said is that with triumphs and advantages, that's the realm based on the mechanics of the system. That's the realm of what the players have control of. And I think you're right. It's important to have some elements of where triumphs and advantages can be spent, especially when it comes to, offering some advice where the players get a little bit stuck. But when it comes to knowing exactly what's going to go on in that scenario so that it's creating less work for the GM so that they can focus on the story and everything that's going around them, is to provide some examples of despairs and threats. And I know, Chris, that you've done that in some of your adventures that you've written as well.
Yes, yeah, it's a common tactic I've found to be helpful. For despairs, I think it's almost mandatory, at least from what I write, because it's one of those things. As a GM, you get to decide how despairs are spent. Yep. So when that oh crap moment hits the dice, bam, there's no analysis paralysis. And even though typically triumphs are determined by players, like you said, it never hurts to have a suggestion ready for a good one that the GM can throw out, because we've all been playing games, whether it's at home or out and about at conventions, where the players are debating for 10 seconds or not knowing what to do with the triumph. And if the GM can pipe up and say, I have a suggestion, that the players are, yes, please. And savvy players will also typically tend to listen to the GM's suggestion, because it usually means it's going to make for a better game. So yeah, I'm all for that. Absolutely. Excellent. Well, this has been interesting discussion.
It has.
We've run the gamut over a lot of different places, and it's been fascinating, Sterling, to get kind of a glimpse into your mind. And we were so eager to bring you on to talk about this because we've had some people say, look, this is an area of content creation that I don't even know where to begin. And it's something that we feel is so terribly useful to, one, the success of a published product on the Foundry, especially if you're going after your own setting. And two, even from our experiences, can be so beneficial for a home game. So this interesting look into kind of how you should think about it and how you should look has been incredibly helpful to me. I guess to wrap this conversation up and kind of bring it home, I really would like to solicit some final thoughts from you as an experienced and award-winning RPG writer. What advice can be given by Mr. Sterling Hershey for the aspiring writers out there who want to make great content? What are the biggest nuggets of wisdom you can impart?
No pressure. Well, okay. So for making great content, if you're make something that you like yourself first of all. If you're writing an encounter, you're writing an adventure, and it's just not coming out the way you want, doesn't seem quite fun enough, then you probably want to change that up. Don't just because you've made an outline doesn't mean if you get partway into it and you're like, oh, this really isn't working out the way I hoped, or if you're into a playtest and people are like, oh, this isn't quite as much fun as I had hoped, go back, look at it again, see what we can revise to maybe it's just a small change that can bring out whatever flavor or element or story piece that you want to highlight, or maybe it's just that story piece doesn't work for this particular adventure, and you pull that out, set that aside. Maybe you can use it in the next one. Yeah, I mean, don't get too hung up on elements that seem like they have to be there if they're not working in the story or just aren't as much fun as you thought going in. From a more of a game design mechanical standpoint, I find that writing from outlines actually does help me quite a lot. I end up making a lot of big decisions in the outline phase, and then it makes it much easier just to write now part of that is, of course, being a freelancer, I need to hit a certain amount of word count, and it's easier for me to focus on getting those words down on paper or on the screen if I don't have to sit there and decide every aspect of whatever it is I'm trying to write about. If I can work out at least the major elements in the outline phase, that actually does save me a lot of time in the writing side. On the writing side,
very good advice. And then going back to what you said, like self-editing, whether it's, especially content, that's hard. It's hard for writers to do. It's also hard for any creator to take critical review or critical stock of the work they've done and not cling to, parts and pieces of it in a very personal way. It's hard. It's very hard.
And if you're creating your own setting or whatever for sale, and if you can afford to have an editor, great, do that. At the very least, have friends or people that understand what you're trying to do and understand gaming. Have them at least read through it, and then so when I get feedback from Fantasy Flight or whatever publisher I'm working with, we'll send in a draft, and then I'll get comments back. And it doesn't. I tend to do it the same way. When I get the comments back, I'll look at them. I'll look over them. Sort of scan down quickly to get an idea of how on track or off track I might be in certain areas. And then I'll actually put it away for a little while and then come back to it, whether it's the next day or whatever. Because if I try and I don't get overly upset about recommendations, but like everybody else, there are times where it's just like, oh man, didn't really like that part. Or pointing out something where I've actually made a mistake or something like that, a mechanical mistake.
It happens.
It does. Oh, it happens. Yeah, it does happen. But I find that if I can go through that emotional response first, put it aside, and then come back to it later, and then more objectively go, okay, yes, you're right, I got to fix this. Or no, you didn't really follow what I was trying to do, and then I can write an email back and say, hey, here's what I was trying to do, and it may or may not fly, but But yeah, to be able to take criticism, and but also don't just blindly accept it all. I mean, there are times where you might have a better idea of what you're trying to achieve than the person that's doing the editing or if it's a friend, their comments, you can't just take them all completely at face value. You do need to assess whether, this is right. I feel like this is right, or no, I want to go this direction because I feel now it's an actual mistake, grammatical mistake or something like that. You should fix it. But from a story standpoint, it's your setting or adventure.
The other thing that, just very quickly, one thing that I just want to mention to people who are creating stuff on the Foundry, and I'd be interested in your take on this, Sterling. When we see some of the stuff that we see from Fantasy Flight Games, they are limited by word count because they're a printed product.
Very much so.
When we're talking about stuff for the Foundry, you're not limited in that way because it's a PDF, you can go to town. But the downside is that if you go to town and just put do a complete brain dump, you're going to potentially confuse the reader. You're potentially going to create more of a storm that you need to, that you really need to start to do what FFG do and hone down. Give yourself a bit of a word count. Know that there's going to be around about, 500 words per page. Depending on, whether you've got artwork and whatever else on there. When it comes to these adventure seeds and set pieces, know that limit yourself to a certain number. Look at what's already out there from FFG. Do a bit of a word count. Work out what that is, and then try to limit yourself to that. You'll find that your ideas will coalesce much more than being just a little bit airy-fairy out there type thing. Would you agree with that?
Yes. In fact, when we were working on products, Fantasy Flight, when they send out the information to us, we get a number of outlines or product descriptions, but we also get a document that tells us what pages we're working on. They will have actually outlined every page, not outlined, they will actually have already figured out how much do they want to devote to each topic, whether it's a certain, and how many pages are devoted to a planet or a character or whatever it is. And then they will actually break that down even further and have a chart where it says this page gets, X number of words, this page has art on it, so it has this other lesser number of words. And then they've done that for the whole product. And so that also tells them how many words they've got in the product, how they're going to split that up to the different freelancers. And of course, since freelancers get paid by the word, that's and if that's actually another good point. If you are engaging with other freelancers, you definitely, and they are getting paid by the word, then you definitely need to control your costs by determining what number of words you or can afford to pay at a given rate. But from there's a few things here. One is if you just start writing and just keep going without any sort of organization, then you might ramble off into areas that are a little off to the side. They're maybe not the core of what you're trying to do, and limiting the number of pages will help, like you said, will help focus your product and distill it down to its best parts, hopefully. Yep. And the other thing about this too is that once you start looking around, if you're going to sell this and not just put it up for whatever people want to pay you, then you start to need to look at, okay, what other products are available in this for Genesys or whatever, or DM's Guild if you're doing that, whatever it is. How many pages are some of these other products using? What prices do they seem to be successful charging or make sense? And so, and you'll find in other longer standing creation or community content creation programs, you can get some pretty wildly different page numbers, page counts, and sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not. Depends on, because the other thing about community content is that you have writers and developers of all different experience levels, but they're all trying to compete in this sort of same space. So if you're looking to see what other people are up to, I'm not saying you all need, if you have a 16-page adventure, they all should cost this. You can't do that. But it does give you an idea of what might be successful at a given price point.
Absolutely.
And your early advice is key to me. It's like the best analogy I could think of is when you're thinking about the amount of content you're writing, and as you say, not going off into tangents or things that are too much. Yes, you've got the freedom with non-printed products to not really care about word count, but think of it as a game master. If your player hands you a 25-page backstory, what is your response going to be?
Yes.
Give me a month.
Excellent point.
And a highlighter.
I don't know. I find that content creators got to look at it the same way.
Yep.
Yes, I understand. You may think this is the coolest thing in the world, but you've got to divorce yourself from that. So I don't know. That's at least my analogy on that topic.
And it does get into kind of like with the Adventure Seed, how much do you write? I mean, I remember getting, like, I think it was the original Greyhawk box set way back in the day, and they had descriptions of the different countries, but they were really short. And so there wasn't enough there, I felt like, at least at my experience level at the time. I was like, okay, well, that's great, but what do I do with all these different elements? I felt like, is there more out there? And of course, in some cases there were in adventures, but yet if you go the other direction and you get a tome of hundreds of pages right out of the gate, you got to convince somebody to take the time to read all that. And especially if you're not a known game company or author or whatever, people will be more hesitant to pick that up. So if I see a product that's out there for, I don't know, I'm just throwing numbers out there, $25, and there's 400 pages, there's a good chance I'm not going to go for that, just because I'll be like, well, first of all, I won't know if it's how good it is, but second of all, I'll be like, that's a lot of time and effort to devote to something that I may or may not want. Whereas if you can break that down into smaller elements, number one, you'll have maybe a better chance of selling more things at a different price, at different prices, but also it gives people a chance to buy into your idea. And then if they like it, then they might continue to buy later elements. So going back to like, any game line will have start off with the core book or the core setting, and then you add on from there. When you're deciding to make your setting, you got to decide how much you're going to put in that core first product, because it needs to be detailed enough to have a full setting where people understand what they can do with it and what makes it unique or fun without sort of overwhelming the reader. And then if you want to detail out other areas of your setting, then great, the people who have bought into it, they know, oh, hey, they might recognize the name of the country or the name of the NPC that this next product is about. Whereas if you put them all in one giant book, that they may not see that, or may not want to spend the time on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, this comes back full circle again, as you hinted at a moment ago, for Adventure Seeds, right?
Yes.
And this is one of the reasons that Adventure Seeds are a fantastic idea, because they give you, okay, wow, you've written 2 paragraphs on this particular country, or this particular thing or theme or trope within your setting. What do I do with that? Well, you know what? Here's 3 or 4 Adventure Seeds. Here's what you can do with that.
Yep.
And great way to flesh that out. Excellent.
And we do it all the time in all the, the career books for the Star Wars games, setting books. I mean, we do this sort of thing a lot. It's a really useful thing.
And I think that speaks sort of volumes. If you've got a company like FFG and an experienced writer such as yourself, Sterling, who is doing this, maybe it's something you should be doing too.
Yeah, there's probably a reason.
Yeah.
If every company you see out there is doing something similar like this, it's been proven to be useful.
Yep, absolutely.
The other thing it's fun too is and this doesn't happen a lot, but if somebody comes back to you later and said, "Hey, I took that idea and here's what happened in my game," and something really cool comes out of it, that can be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can ask them too. You can also ask them, hey, you took it in this direction. What inspired you to do that? And then you might learn something about your own setting or game from how they're using it.
If nothing else, it is a great marketing tool for your own product.
Well, this has been some stellar advice. Should I say some sterling advice?
Well done.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. That was
You went
wow.
there. Right. Good.
Yeah. Okay. This has been some excellent advice, sir. So thank you. And speaking of promotional, obviously, Sterling, we thank you for joining us for this talk. We would love to have you back on the show if you're willing, maybe for a future episode. We have a recurring segment where we kind of talk about some of the amazing products that are on the Foundry. So we'd love to have you back to specifically talk about one of your products. But to kind of close things out very quickly, you've got 2 things on the Foundry right now. For people that know your work and know the quality of it, what are those called, and what are they?
Yeah, so the first one is something called Instant Adversaries, and what it's you can use it with any setting. And what it is, basically, over the years when I've been running games and I need an NPC on the fly, and a lot of times you'll flip open the book to find something that's close to what you need, and it seems like it's very often that I'll do that and I'll be like, oh well, I need that guy, that person to have a better gunnery skill, something like that. And then halfway to the encounter, I'll forget that I changed it, just because I'm in the flow of responding to the players, and I'll glance down at the product, and I'll just forget at that moment that, oh yeah, I changed their defense, or I increased this characteristic. And so what Instant Adversaries does is it gives the GM the ability to sort of create a NPC very, very quickly right at the table by checking a few boxes and doing a little bit of math. I couldn't quite get away from doing no math. Then you just have that at hand. You use it through the adventure, and then through that encounter, and then so you can do it. Either whether you're marking in pencil on something you've printed out, or what I do is I'll put it in a sleeve protector, page protector, and use dry erase markers to just check the boxes and write, because you can go through and you pick which characteristic you want to focus that character on. So if they need to be really good at brawn or really bad at agility, something like that, you start off with that. Pick a set of numbers that basically you go in and say, okay, here's the level of, or the number I need for brawn, and then it'll also have additional numbers for the other characteristics written out next to them. If you need to change one of those, you just mark it out and note the different number that you want. Then there's a set of skills. So like if I'm using brawn, let me just use brawn for an example. Brawn, I might say, hey, okay, I need a character with 4 brawn. Okay, well in this case it's also got 2s across the board except for will, which is 3, and presence, which is 1. If I wanted to change one of those other things, I'd just mark it out and replace it. Then I would jump down to, there's a list of skills. So I've got just from a overall set of skills, so like brawler, melee fighter, survivalist are the 3 that I've got, and there's some skills listed next to each one of those. And so if I need the brawler character, I can say, okay, well, I need a brawn of 4, I'll check that box. I want it to be a brawler, I'll check that box, and that gives me athletics 2, brawl 3, melee 2, vigilance 1. And I'll say, okay, talents and abilities. This will be an adversary, so I can check the adversary box and decide how much of an adversary it is. And then maybe a couple of other real basic talents. And at the bottom, I'll have some weapons that character is likely to use. So if brawn, it might be a sword or knife, or if it's a creature, it can bite or have fangs. And then I jump back up and in this on the page and just fill out the derived stats. So for soak, wounds, strain, defense, and there's a separate line for minions if this is actually going to be a minion. And that section shows you right on the page what to add together. And so you can do all this once, especially after you've done it a couple of times. You can do all this real quickly. And I've got one of those columns for brawn, agility, intellect, cunning, willpower, and presence. The second half of this product is based around vehicles, and it's a little bit different. It's really more of a table of different vehicle types, and then with a silhouette, max speed, handling, defense, armor, hull, and health threshold and system strain. And again, this is just so I can get a vehicle or a vehicle type just quickly on the table, and especially for Genesis, where there hasn't been a lot of vehicles available so far. So these are not full vehicle write-ups by any means, but again,
it lets you create it. And I wanted to. I'm glad you're talking about this because I was actually speaking to somebody online, and I was like, well, Sterling Hershey's got instant adversaries, and they're like, well, I've got a lot of the NPC compendiums. I'm like, no, you don't understand. It's like that's not what it is at all.
Yeah. Well, and it's a little bit difficult to explain without showing it. And I remember when the Foundry was first being talked about, and I was discussing with some other people that were involved in it, sort of what I was trying to do, and they sort of would get it. But yeah, once I had it up and out there, then I had people coming back and said, "Okay, now I understand what you were trying to do." And I do provide a couple of examples in there too. And in fact, if you're on the Foundry, if you bring up the PDF preview, you can see the example pages with them all marked up and so forth.
It's like if you're a game master who likes having NPC cards, if you find that to be incredibly valuable, so that you have an NPC on the fly, but you hate the fact that that card is never going to be perfectly customized for the scenario at hand. This is like the best of both worlds.
Yes.
So.
And that's exactly the situation, because I use the NPC cards for Star Wars, and of course they've got some for Genesis that I don't have yet. But that was the exact thing. Whether it was the card or looking up stats in a book, same way, same problem.
Yeah.
Now this is not. I will say this is not to replace the NPC generation card. If you're trying to make a serious NPC that's like the bad guy for your entire adventure, this is not the tool for that. I mean, you could do it, but you'll be much more satisfied with one you build yourself. This is very much intended to be more on the fly kind of things.
Seat of your pants. Yep.
Yes.
Very cool. So you got that out there. It's been doing very well, but even better than that has been your adventure module for Android. Yes.
Well, in terms of sales, actually, Instant Adversaries has been.
Is it?
Yep.
There you go.
Yeah, it's I think it's silver right now. I'd have to go back and look.
Wow.
But no, PowerPlay is sold. PowerPlay is my Android mini campaign. Okay, so this is actually a pretty good subject for this podcast anyway, because talking about how far do you go with something. So this is a mini campaign within about 30 pages, 32 pages, I think. And this was definitely a situation where, as I was developing the idea for this, and I was sort of bouncing ideas, actually off talking to my wife about it, and trying to figure out where that line would be, and was describing what I was trying to do, and she's like, "That is more than one adventure." It was seriously more than one adventure. So then I was like, "All right." So then it's like, "All right, well, I can go this mini campaign route," and so there's basically 3 adventures outlined in there. Not outlined. There's actually encounters with additional advice on how to expand them or what other things they might lead to. So so far, it's been selling pretty well, and that was fun. It's been fun to do, and I will be interested in hearing some feedback on that in the future.
Absolutely. Well, maybe, Sterling, you'd like to come back on the show to talk about PowerPlay, because I know that I'm totally excited to discuss it with you.
Sure, absolutely.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much, Sterling, for taking the time, and I know that your time is precious. So thank you very much for coming on to the show to talk to us about this topic, about adventure seeds and module creation. Look, the work that you've done in the past, I'm a bit of a fanboy myself when it comes to your stuff. I've been with Star Wars D6 all the way from the very beginning. To have you on the show, I'm probably a little bit awestruck. So thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Sterling. Oh, what a great conversation. I love Sterling Hershey so much.
So do I. And I know I fanboy every single time I go anywhere near Sterling. It's just like I become all because he was so heavily involved with Star Wars D6, and that's really where I got my my training wheels, I guess, when it comes to being a GM. So his contribution to the RPG was amazing, and continues to do so. So talking to Sterling is amazing. But I just like
I like Sterling as a human.
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
He's so kind and he's so generous, and I mean he puts up with us, but but I've seen him put up with things. He's just a genuinely wonderful human.
Yeah.
I first met Sterling Hershey 9 years ago.
Right.
Okay. I'd been doing the Order 66 podcast for almost 2 years at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd had Sterling on.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Mm-hmm. And it was one of those things that it wasn't lost on me who Sterling Hershey was, but it was almost like he was this paragon of, I'm at Gen Con for the very first time in my life,
right,
9 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I go to Gen Con and I happen to meet Sterling Hershey. Like, it shows up. It's like, oh my gosh, Sterling. And I'm there with my wife, and he's like, hey, how's it going? And you know how it is when you meet somebody like that. You expect to, to have a nice handshake and be cordial. And okay, well, I'll go back into the mud, with the rest of the plebeians.
Yep.
And this man, he chit chats for a while, and he looks at us. He says, well, hey, what are you guys doing right now? It was Sunday afternoon. He's like, what are you guys doing right now? I want to go kind of troll the exhibit hall. You guys want to come with me?
Wow.
And I know. And it was like, sure. And we hung out with Sterling Hershey for 4 hours and walked the exhibit hall and talked and learned about all the games and stuff he likes, and met his wife Mary, and and just this genuine, amazing human being. Yeah. He's been to Gamer Nation Con like almost every year we've had it. He just comes. We had him as a guest of honor one year. Yep. But even then, he just comes on his own, like Sam Stewart does, actually.
Yeah.
And just runs games and chats with people, and is just an all-around amazing human.
So approachable.
I love Sterling Hershey.
Yeah, so approachable as a man. He's just, and I mean, it was great that he's come onto the show, but I agree with you. Every time that I've had anything to do with him at Gamer Nation Con, because that's really the only time that I get to sort of, rub elbows with some of the writers and things like that. But he's always been so accommodating. He'll take the time to really talk to you about what the industry is on such a level that it doesn't feel like you're being spoken down to. It doesn't feel, not that many people do in the industry, but some people sort of get that little bit of elitism. There is just nothing like that. It is just pure niceness, I guess, is the only thing that I can think of right now to describe him. But no, genuinely, I agree with you. Wonderful human being, and it was great to have him on the show.
Yeah.
All right, so we digress as we fanboy over Sterling Hershey, but thanks again, Sterling, for being on the show. So should we welcome another guest onto the show, Chris?
Oh, I've been waiting for this one. Yeah, let's do it.
So let's welcome him into a segment we call Breaking the Mold.
Breaking the Mold.
The Genesys Foundry is an exciting community of fan-created content for Genesys. New settings, new rules options, adventures, campaign modules, and much, much more. But some creators, they go above and beyond, subvert our expectations, and break the mold with their work. Our Breaking the Mold segment is dedicated to showcasing an exciting offering available right now in the Genesys Foundry as we separate the pure alloy from the slag and point you to the best content out there.
Indeed. Now, tonight's guest is one of the pillars of the Genesys RPG community. He's the moderator of the Genesys RPG Facebook community, the Reddit page, author of 2 amazing supplements you can find right now on the Genesys Foundry, with no doubt more coming on the way, and host of the Don't Despair podcast.
Fantastic. And without further ado, let's introduce you to the author of The Something Strange setting, as well as the aforementioned many things, Mr. Scott Zumwalt.
Hello.
Scott, my brother from Texas. How are you? Welcome to the show,
fantastic. Man. Thank you. You forgot 2 things, though.
Oh.
Ian.
Yes. Oh. What did I forget?
The Discord server. Also
of course.
admin that.
Yes, you did.
And the lesser-known MeWe group.
What's MeWe?
What is MeWe?
MeWe is it's a new social media platform. It's very similar to Facebook. I don't want to sell it too much because whatever. I'm not here to hawk MeWe, but it's a thing. They promised not to sell your data.
Right.
They have a whole business model on how they do that or whatever. A lot of people from Google Plus went to MeWe after Google Plus went away.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, is it free?
Yeah, it's totally free.
And yet they're not selling your data.
Yeah, you can buy emoji and other weird things. I don't know how well it's doing. It's probably got VC funding and a bunch of other crap.
Right.
Maybe. I'll check it out. My wife is a professional marketer, and she always relates to me a marketing saying that I take to heart. If a product is free, guess what?
You're the product.
You're the product. So, but okay, MeWe. Well, let's go check it out. Well, dude, well, screw all the rest, man. Forget what you've written. Forget Discord. Forget Facebook. Forget your podcast, man. What's the most important is that you are the moderator of the MeWe group. Oh, I love it. Oh, man. So you mentioned you're kind of exhausted. You've had a hell of a weekend.
Yeah. I just got back from the Mermaid Festival. My wife is a professional mermaid. And so yesterday we had a mermaid ball where she was the head mermaid and she had 10 other mermaids with her and I was the mer wrangler for the evening. So I had to take care of 11 mermaids in total, making sure that they were unmolested and, got to the restroom when they needed to and carried them around to, go onto couches and back into the green room. And then this morning was the mermaid parade. And then after that was the mermaid art fair. And I just got home about 40 minutes ago.
Wow.
Yowza.
Yeah.
When you said mermaid wrangler, I had an image in my head of you with a giant net and chaps,
I wouldn't recommend chaps when wrangling mermaids.
Well, yeah.
Leather goods in general, probably bad to wear in the water.
Probably.
Right.
But this is Texas.
This is Texas. We wear leather everywhere, apparently, right?
This is getting weird. Anyway, so maybe we should talk about a little bit more about Genesys. What do you think?
Okay.
It's fine. I mean, what's the runtime usually? 3 or 4 hours? This will fill up a lot of that space.
Yeah, 3 or 4 hours. Yep, no doubt. All right, Scott. So, Scott, we ask this of all of our guests. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your gaming career. I mean, obviously, we know that you wrangle mermaids, but what else do you do in the gaming realm?
Wow. I mean, since Genesys came out, I actually don't even play any other games. That's consumed my entire life.
Yeah.
I think it's the only way I can produce all of that content if I just ignore everything else. But I grew up with D&D, advanced D&D, 2nd edition. Mm-hmm. One of my first RPG experiences was actually Vampire the Masquerade, which, may be a big shock if you know what Something Strange is. And tons of board games and stuff. Mm. Was there a second part to that question?
No, that was pretty much it. So this is really the first time that you've had any dealings with the industry as far as gaming goes. That this was your jump off point, for want of a better term.
Oh yeah, totally. I've never produced official content. I haven't even ever produced DM's Guild content or anything like that.
Mm.
Genesys just brings that out, I guess.
Something. This past year and a half has been a whirlwind.
It has been. Well, okay. So you say obviously, that you're living, eating, breathing, crapping Genesys at this point. So it's what you're doing. What is your first love of Genesys? And what we mean by that is we love to ask this of our guests. What style of game or game settings or themes do you just really like to get on the table the most when you play Genesys or run Genesys?
I'll give you one guess. I mean, it's modern horror. And it's actually the first game of Genesys I played was running the very first proto version of Something Strange.
Mm-hmm.
I had a group of people that I met in this little town, and they wanted to do like a D&D night, but like Genesys had just come out, and I was like, what if we didn't do D&D? Because I've been really tired of fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
I had a year-long 5e game that was weekly, and had a hard time like coming up with more and more content. Yeah, it was a 7-player table.
Wow.
And I got burned out. So I was just like, you know what? I'm done with D&D. Genesys is a thing now. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to go whole hog into Genesys. And this group was like, okay, well, if we're not doing D&D, we'd like to do like a Monster of the Week type game. And I was like, all right. So using just the CRB, the core rulebook, I didn't even actually create any other content. I just... you guys just use the core archetypes, just whatever talents, and we're just going to let it, fall out. Whatever's going to work and whatever doesn't, I'm going to learn the system same time as you, and we'll see what works and what doesn't.
Very cool.
Obviously, it worked for you.
Yeah.
Something worked.
Now that people have a good idea of who you are, but they may not know your product. Now, I know that you've spoken about Something Strange just now. And we would say to everyone, give us your elevator pitch, basically. Tell us a little bit about Something Strange, because it's a standalone setting for people who love their horror, mysteries of the unknown and things that go bump in the night. Mm-hmm. It's one of a handful of setting books rather than adventures, and it's a standout product as far as I'm concerned, and one that you have clearly put a lot of work into.
Oh, thank you.
So tell us a little bit about the setting. What would you say to someone who was really interested in purchasing it?
So it's obviously modern horror, urban fantasy setting. It should be everything that you need to do werewolves, vampires, and magicians in the modern world. There's the elevator pitch. There's it in 2 sentences. But going a little deeper than that, I try to make sure that, so you got all the gear you need. I do a few more talents. Before Ready Fight, we didn't really have, some good unarmed stuff. So I actually have a few unarmed talents in there that were surprisingly almost the same as what Keith had written. So that was neat. As far as the gear goes, I took care to get primitive weapons balanced with modern weapons. Mm-hmm. So that forced me to add in a new mechanic of weapon noise, because really the only reason to use a bow over an assault rifle is how silent it is. Because, right? So I had to add that in, especially if you're shooting guns in an urban environment. Maybe people, there should be a little bit of a mechanic to understand, like, people will hear that, and then have a mechanic to, mitigate that sound using I have a suppressed item quality.
Mm-hmm. That's cool.
And I think that's really the only thing I really added as far as extra rules. I try to keep it as base and as core as possible to make picking up and using it as simple as possible.
And it's been a successful strategy. But there's some interesting stuff. I mean, but you talk about a couple of unique things. Can you dive in a bit deeper? Could you whet our appetites maybe with a sneak peek of something very specific in this product that is so unique you won't see it anywhere else on the Foundry?
So I think my brilliant thing, my eureka moment in creating Something Strange was the supernatural talents. So it's a tier 1 talent to be a werewolf. It's a tier 1 talent to be a vampire. And I did this for a really specific reason, because I had a player who had only built his character with the core rulebook archetypes. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about, well, okay, how would we have our players be, or characters be werewolves and vampires? I was like, well, after character creation, the really only way to do that would be like to make a talent. So, well, that makes total sense, because you're going to start out as yourself, right? As your core archetype, and then you become this thing later on.
It's very interesting you bring that up. I will say I read that, and I kind of had a forehead slap moment when I did it. One of the things I've been like, I have like 7 back burners. This is on the 8th back burner. Is a Victorian horror setting called Gaslight and Moonlight. And I'll be probably in full transparency. I watched the rather fun, cheesy, and terrible good bad movie Van Helsing, and that was the vibe I was going for, right? Mm-hmm. So I was like, okay, well, man, so you can have vampires or half vampires or werewolves or constructed Frankenstein-y monsters, and I went the archetype route, in that initial design work, and then but then you bring up the point, and it was one of those forehead slap moments. Like, well, yeah, okay, half this stuff, especially vampirism and werewolfism. I mean, or excuse me, vampirism and lycanthropy. You can catch this, right? You can get bitten. So if you're an experienced character, how do you represent that? You certainly can't do it with an archetype. So yeah, that was a good forehead slap moment for me. Yeah, brilliantly done, sir.
Yeah, everyone seems to have the same initial thought when they want to do a vampire, werewolf, or something like that. And it's like, oh, just make an archetype to do it. So, and then I was, do the talent. Everyone's like, oh my God, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah. And what's great about it is it's infinitely malleable, because if in my futuristic setting where we have space vampires, they have the older you get, the more powerful abilities you get and the cooler things you can do. Well, you can just represent that with ever improving talents.
And that's exactly what I do. I've got a whole slew of like pseudo talent trees, right? There's like base and improved versions of all those things, but you have to have the vampire talent first.
So yeah, great stuff, man. Great stuff.
Thank you.
Very good. So, Scott, what makes Something Strange different from other settings that we've seen on the Genesis Foundry?
Oh boy, that would assume I'm really familiar with all the other ones, isn't it? I'm outing myself here. No, I've looked at a lot of them, but not all of them. My brilliant eye for layout design.
It's all about self-promotion, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things I touched on there is keeping it as close to the rules as written as possible. Like I modify very little.
Yep.
On purpose. Because I think that you should be able to just take it, and you don't have to like, okay, well, magic works this way. I read in the core rule book, but now it works like this way in this setting, and so I got to use like a different magic. And that's fine. You can do that, and it's perfectly valid for a lot of settings to do that. But I didn't want to mess around with it. I already had players that were using the core rulebook magic, so I didn't want to like invent new magic rules for them to have to figure out.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because it certainly increases the accessibility for other players who may not have experienced anything else other than they've gone to the store and picked up the core rules. So that's a good strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So Scott, one of the things that also you have become very well known for in the Genesis RPG community is, for some time now, the plethora of game aids to help new and existing GMs and players. And with that, you kind of showed us all that you definitely have an eye for layout, especially and a skill with InDesign. Can you tell us a little bit about that skill set and where that stems from?
Yeah, sure. So my first job right out of high school was as a web designer. And this was in 1997. So at the time, I think we were on Adobe Photoshop version 3. And so I got really familiar with those Adobe tools at the time. Until they paid full price for them, of course. So basically, I've just been like learning the new versions as they come out over the last years. But when I first started doing the Genesis stuff, I wasn't super great at InDesign, but I was super good at other Adobe products like Photoshop and Illustrator. And when I was looking at all the, Genesis was out and there was like some holes for people like needed things. And I was like, well, I think I can do this. Let me pop up my copy of InDesign that I just randomly happened to have for no reason. And let me just try and lay some stuff out. And I think one of the first things I did was actually the sci-fi weapons, GM Huzzes, sci-fi weapon thing.
Indeed.
Yeah, that's right.
Wait, no, that was the second one. The first one I did was a character sheet. I did the character sheet first, mainly because I saw the official sheet we got was heavily JPEG'd. Which is a standard for some reason when they post some stuff up. FFG, when they post stuff up, it's super reduced in the file size, so we get a lot more compressed images in those PDFs. So I was like, well, I can do way better vector images than those. So I was definitely really good at Illustrator. So I was able to do that, and I was like, okay, well, I need InDesign to lay this out properly. So I did all that, and my first versions were done incorrectly. Just way wrong. And over the last year or so, I've gotten way better at it.
Is that so that would have been the vectorized character sheet that I believe GM Caitlin printed up about the size
the
of
very
it.
same.
Yeah, wow.
The giant picture, yeah.
That was hilarious when she did that.
That was good. I showed that to my wife, and I was like, look, there's people in Australia just printed out my character sheet. Like, gigantic. What is happening?
Everything's bigger in Australia, Mike.
Including our character sheets.
I was big as in Texas.
It's funny when she had to actually use that when she forgot her character sheet a number of times. She had to refer back to that. Hilarious. But anyway. So before the Foundry, there was a lot of fan-generated content, as we know. It was out in the wild, and Something Strange was one of those products which was out there. It's been around for a while, and you obviously did a lot of beta testing using that sort of format. So with the advent of the Foundry, it enabled you to make that into something amazingly spectacular. So what was some of the challenges associated with this process, including taking it from a readily accessible format to a fully purchasable setting?
So it's been play tested over the past year or so, and when I needed this document for my players, I just put everything in there from the core rulebook into it, so they wouldn't have to refer to the core rulebook for any of their other talents or gear or any of this other stuff. I just dumped it all in this one thing, printed it out, and handed it to them. So the versions that were previous, had all this stuff that I absolutely could not include with the Foundry version. So I had to pull a lot of content out there and then create the more unique gaps of the things that were now missing. Because the things I had to take out were like Shadow the Beanstalk and Tyranoth talents.
Right.
And that forced me in a really good way to come up with my own unique things that definitely need to be in there. And so it's, those kinds of limitations that let us be more creative.
And it's clear that that's been so you take that and combine it with the previous experience you've had, that led to obviously this product.
Yeah.
In its full-fledged glory. Now, another interesting thing about this, and I'd love to get into this discussion briefly if we could, because you, me, Hooli, we kind of share an opinion. We on this show talk a lot about artwork. Since we get a lot of feedback from listeners and people who are frankly intimidated by submitting to the Foundry. Many feel that they may not be able to do their settings or products justice because they lack a budget for artwork. It can be terribly expensive. Now, where I think we're all in agreement is that you also are a big believer that art isn't always necessary to make a product look great and to make it pop. This is also something we talked about with Darren West when we had him on to talk about Hadra Shard. Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this and advice?
So art is great. It helps inspire as you read something. There's a reason that RPG products typically have the art. It really just makes it a more pleasing product to read through. But if you're an indie publisher and you're just trying to get a basic idea out there, you don't absolutely need the art. Get your content to stand on its own first. The rest should fall into place. Now, one thing that that a lot of people may struggle with, even outside of that, is like the layout and design of it.
Mm-hmm.
Now I did a unique design for Something Strange, and that was all just, my own graphic skills. And I understand, most people are not going to have that. And so the Foundry was able to give us these templates of just the core rulebook styling, which is fine. It's totally fine. And you should just get your content in that format and just make it work on its own. And if there's something you think that you definitely need to have a picture of, then describe the thing as best you can. This is a writing project. Write. Create. But if you got the budget for art, go for it. But the tactic I did, because the latest version of Something Strange does have artwork in it. And what I was able to do is, after I had sold so many copies, I used that money in my DriveThru RPG account to purchase licensable stock art from artists on DriveThru. And a lot of the pieces I got, they were only like $4 a piece.
Yep.
So, and just toss them in there. It gives it a little more visual, breaks it up visually, gives a little more inspiration when you're reading certain things. It definitely makes it better, but I don't think that it was poor with the lack of it.
It wasn't. And we chatted, I think, last episode about that decision where you and Keith and a few others have said, yeah, we're gonna reinvest in art, which is just a brilliant decision. But the layout was decent on its own. But even then, I think your point is incredibly well taken, and I think this is probably such a sage nugget I think every listener should understand. Earlier in this episode, Scott, we were talking about some of the newer products that came out on the Foundry just in the past couple weeks, and one of them we weren't too impressed with. It was a new setting, a fantasy setting called the Gods of New Braemar, and it was one of those things that just didn't. It was really, if I had to describe it in a word, it would be a shrug. Okay. Now it had no art and virtually no layout. Okay. Last episode, we talked about a setting from Peter Holland called Fame Factor, which was another fantasy setting, but it had something unique. It really popped. It had virtually no art and literally no layout, but it was still a decent product that I would recommend to someone because, again, the way in which it was written, the content stood on its own. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Scott, from your perspective, what sort of nugget of advice, I guess, would you provide to anyone wanting to submit to the Foundry?
The first thing to do is to write. Like, you've got to just keep writing and make a bunch of garbage. Like, what is it, Jake the dog? The first step to being sort of good at something is being bad at something. I know I did the quote wrong, but the essence of it is there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like you just gotta start. You gotta be bad at something before you can be good at it. So you just have to keep writing, and you have to keep testing your ideas.
Yep.
And the other part of that is to make something for yourself. Make the thing that you want to be made. Don't make something you think is going to sell well, because it's not going to be as good as the thing that you really like to make.
And that's something that I think that echoes across from everyone that we've spoken to thus far on The Forge, is that do something that you're passionate about, because if you're not, it's going to show. And clearly the product that you've produced is something that you are passionate about. And that's one of the core reasons why it's as good as it is.
Yeah, because as I'm writing it, I'm excited to write. Right? If someone's like, "Oh, hey Scott, we really need you to make a yet another fantasy setting," and I was like, "Oh God, I do not want to do that." But this I super love doing.
Absolutely.
Well, okay. So with that passion, the things that you super love doing, what's next for you and the Foundry? What can fans of your work expect to find in the months to come from you on the Foundry?
In the months? Okay. We'll keep it to the months.
Or you can go weeks. I'm fine.
We'll keep it less than 3 months. So the two things I hope to get out very next, I have a magic guide.
Cool.
And I have an adventure for Something Strange.
Nice.
Fantastic.
I was hoping to get my Something Strange adventure finished first, but I made a tactical decision that made it take longer. I was going to do a really short, like 2-hour, 3-hour playable version, and then I decided, no, I want it to be way longer than that. So I'm having to rewrite everything and write a whole bunch more content. So I'm like describing almost every single NPC in this town, and there's like multiple locations. I did a 3D rendering of the town that I'm going to be including, and yeah.
That sounds cool. Sounds
Lord.
very cool.
Yeah. So it's taking longer than I thought. And in between writing on that, I started doing this magic guide as people were asking more and more questions about magic and wanting a guide for new players on, how to do spell customizations and stuff like that. So I have created it's basically a spell book, but I have some other parts where it gives like some guidance on some clarifications of magic rules. And the spell book portion is basically I do a version of almost every spell possible, and a narrative flavoring for every single one of them.
Nice.
So that's been taking a minute, but that should be done soon.
That sounds good.
Oh, that sounds great. And would also help solve a huge problem that some players have with Magic. And until you get comfortable with the mechanics, that the idea of it being so open-ended, it leads to a little bit of analysis paralysis sometimes.
Exactly. So I hope that new players can just grab this and go, oh, I just want to do this little spell here. It seems to have the effect I want. And they can just cast it.
That sounds.
It has the difficulty right there and all the rules to go with it.
Yeah, that sounds very exciting. Because I know that every time that we raise Magic as an issue on our Facebook feed, it just blows up. And I know the same thing for on the Genesis, the Genesis community group as well. That clearly people are finding that a little bit difficult to get their head around. So I think that'll be well appreciated, I think, in the community. So good choice.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Good on you.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, man. It's been really fun insight and talk and walk through your head. And for those of you who are listening, of course, if you're not already listening to Don't Despair, our Scott and Others podcast, our sister podcast on the D20 Radio Network, you need to be. And all of you, we know you listeners are liking, of course, the Forge Podcast Facebook page and have probably joined the D20 Radio group as well on Facebook. But you need to join the Genesys RPG community as well. As really the premier place for very focused, content-driven, Genesis-specific discussion on social media. It's fantastic.
Yeah, we tried to, we had this Genesis RPG community umbrella. So however you want to engage with it on whatever your preferred platform is all run by the same people.
Absolutely. It's very, very good.
Yes.
Excellent.
Fantastic. Well, Scott, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing so much about Something Strange. And there is a lot to be taken from this setting, so we appreciate it.
Thank you.
I know I love everybody's work who basically comes onto our show, but especially under Breaking the Mold, because they're just. I've said this in the past. I love people who are just creative, but Scott's just up there with He's not quite Sterling Hershey as far as my fanboyism goes, but he's getting there just with the sheer skill that guy has for getting producing what he's done over the last. It's really only been, as he said during the interview, it's only been about 18 months since he's picked up the Genesis core rules and started to develop that. And I think that's kind of, it reminds me a little bit of some of the stuff that I did right at the start when I was trying to understand how to run Star Wars, and I was listening to the Order 66, and I was generating some vehicle sheets and action sheets just so that I could learn the rules and then give those to my players as well. So yeah, it sort of reminds me of that, and if he can get pushed up the hierarchy more, great. I'm more than happy to do that. But no, it's really, really good. So
love it. Yeah, it was really good talking to him. And what he's done for the community is great. And I am even more excited that I know he's going to be coming to Gamer Nation Con in the spring.
Indeed.
But we'll be talking about that in future episodes.
Absolutely. All right. So, we've got some questions, I think, Chris, from some of our listeners. Should we get on to that?
Yeah. We really should.
Right. And we're going to call that segment, as we always do, Under the Hammer.
Under the Hammer.
And welcome to Under the Hammer, the segment where we will answer your games and rules questions about the Genesys role-playing game, as it impacts both rules and content creation and, of course, play. And for this episode, we've got a lot of questions, a few more than normal, which it's amazing. So thank you to everyone who has submitted via email and Twitter and Facebook and Reddit and YouTube. And what was the other one that Scott mentioned before?
Oh, yeah, Discord.
Maybe we should get into that as well. But he mentioned another one.
No, he was talking about what? MeWe?
That's whatever it's called. But anyway, we can only pick 3 to discuss tonight. So, Chris, would you like to read our first question?
Absolutely. Comes in from Facebook from Kate Saunders, who says this. How do you handle a situation where traditionally all the players would be making individual checks? For example, if the players are trying to scale a cliff, would they all individually roll athletics? Would it be a group roll? Stealth also fits into this category. Even perception.
It's a good question, and probably something that we touched base on in the last episode when we talked about stealth. And I know that we've talked about it during this episode as well when we were looking at resilience. It's interesting. I was talking to somebody about this only today, where the system is really designed for one role resolution. So when we start talking group checks, and you may have a different opinion, Chris, but when we're talking group checks, we're talking things like cool or vigilance checks, where everybody at the table is basically making that check. As well as strain recovery at the end of a round, at the end of a turn, an encounter. There are special rules associated with each of those. So for recovering resilience, it is for every success, and I know that there are arguments out there that you should be able to use your advantages for getting back strain as well, but as by the letter of the law, that's not how it works, that it's by successes only, but that's a specific set of rules for that. When it comes to vigilance and cool checks, the advantages can only be used for tie breaking. And it specifically says for a triumph that you get an additional maneuver at the start of the round. There's specific rules for talking about group checks, which kind of to me says that the rules are designed in such a way that it's designed for everybody to work out what they want to do as a group and then make that roll. So when it comes to the question that Kate is asking, I think that under most circumstances, individual checks for things like perception, for things like stealth, roll it into the one check. If you have things, for example, if you're in a fantasy setting and you have someone or you have a group of people, one of whom's wearing chainmail, the other one's wearing plate mail, that both of those have 2 and 1 setback die that should really be taken into consideration if you're making a stealth check, for example. So if you've got everybody at the table doing that, they're obviously talking about what they're going to do. And so suddenly you have the check that is going to have those 3 setback die. But if you've got a rogue or a thief that may know some tricks on how to dampen that, chances are that they've got knack for it. So they can remove 2 of those setback die. And then you're just making 1 check. Now, if you've got multiple people who have good in stealth, or maybe somebody's got a higher agility check, they can be making combined checks, a skilled assist. Or in certain circumstances, it may be a case that they get boost die because they're all trying to, one's trying to look out for what's going to happen next. But then, depending on how many people you're trying to sneak past, you could then be looking at adding setback dice for larger groups to be sneaking past these guards. So you're combining the entire scenario, but you're talking about it first with the players, and they're talking amongst themselves on how they're going to do that. And then go from there. Now, the other thing as well, which is something that isn't covered by Genesys, but is definitely covered under Star Wars, is that they talk about how to use successes and how to use advantages per skill. Now, one of the things that they use specifically for stealth, which you can use for anything really as a basis, is that for each success above the first, you allow somebody else to do the same thing. So if you've got, we'll use her example that she's used athletics. So if you were making a trip across a fast-flowing river that you needed to get everybody to make athletics checks, you might be saying, okay, set the difficulty, you've set up the group check, and for the first time, the first person who's leading the group, they get across, and then for every single additional strength check that their success that they make, they get another person across. Now, that may leave some people across the other side. That's when a second check falls into play. So that's my thoughts. Chris?
I think you're making it way too complicated.
Okay.
I got a few simple rules when it comes to group checks.
Sure.
It has to do with consequences. To put it another way, if one player, let's say they're going through a scenario, I don't care if it's stealth, I don't care if it's perception, I don't care if it's athletics or resilience to cross a river or scale a mountain. If one player fails and the entire party will suffer the consequences, they should not be making individual checks. It's a waste. Make it a group check.
Yep.
Why not? Okay. If the entire party is going to suffer the consequences. Stealth and perception are probably the 2 most egregious examples here.
Yep.
Okay. One person fails their stealth roll, the whole party ends up getting into a fight. Well, screw it. Just make it a group check.
Yep.
Okay. And the rules for that are very clearly laid out in the book.
Yep.
Now, the bold-faced exceptions to this are when you've got scenarios where, and this could happen for stealth, okay, where the negative consequences are only going to apply to the PCs who failed, and you have a way to get the other PCs, whether the consequences are not going to apply to them, then do that. But the other thing, too, is you have to ask yourself, well, okay, and this gets a bit deeper into game theory of this system. Because, Huli, we've said before, one of the things here is try and have these people make as few checks as possible.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep, definitely.
Okay. So I'm gonna upscale the question even more, Kate. Do they need to be making a check? Okay, you need to ask yourself that. Perception, athletics. Do they really need to be making a check? Is there a consequence if they fail? Is it going to impact the story? Okay. And if the answer is yes, okay, then some things like stealth, perception makes total sense. If we're talking about athletics to scale a cliff, at that point, if you're going to go in and say this is necessary and a check needs to be made, make it a larger encounter and turn it into a skill challenge. That's my number 2 rule. Yep. So two rules for me when it comes to group skill checks. One, consequences. If the whole group is going to suffer the consequences for one person failing, make it a group check.
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as Hooli said, of course, but that's the thing. If you're going to do a group check, and one member has talents that reduce, like they have knack for it, well, guess what? That applies to the check. Congratulations. Mm. Don't be afraid to make a difficulty more difficult. Adding one difficulty for increasing it by +1 for a group check. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Don't be afraid to do that. And then my second rule is consider whether this needs to be a check at all or whether it needs to be a skill challenge. Mm. That's it.
Good advice. I think that answers the question. Hopefully it does for you, Kate. So our next question comes from Whiskey Hangover, which is via Reddit. Yay! Another place that we're getting questions from. So Whiskey Hangover asks, can you guys share your thoughts on the Pierce item quality? It just seems so pointless when even the weakest enemies have a soak of 2. There doesn't seem to be any difference between Pierce and just adding +1 to the base damage. What's the point?
Great question. This is one I puzzled over for a little while. But honestly, Hooli, I think we have some thoughts on this, yes?
Absolutely. Now, honestly, great question, Whiskey Hangover. Love the name, by the way. And one that took a little bit of digging to get a definitive answer to, because realistically, there isn't really a reason, but there kind of is. I know that sounds very vague. But the first place we have to look is on page 200 of the core rulebook under Create an Item. Now, it states, with Pierce, just keep in mind that until you get to ratings of 5 or higher, you can think of your Pierce rating as the equivalent of adding damage to checks. Pierce has a diminishing returns after the value exceeds the average soak value, so price weapons accordingly. Now, what does that actually mean? What is it saying? It's basically saying that adding weapon damage is actually more powerful than Pierce. Pierce quality is potent for sure, but with, say, Pierce 3 versus Soak 2, that extra 1 point, or the difference between the two, it's being lost. It doesn't go anywhere. If it was damage, however, that extra 1 point would be converted to wounds, thus being the more powerful option.
Yes, and it's about balance and playability ultimately. Placing higher damage values on things can really start to annoy your players. That's another thing to consider. Yeah. The Pierce quality allows you to keep a weapon frightening, keep it within the realm of other weapons, and not punish characters with a low soak value. And after all, not everyone's going to have a high brawn. And several ranks in the tough and talent. Not everyone's going to play that brawny character that we talked about in our last episode.
Exactly right.
But that distinction between pierce and increased damage, I think it's also worth noting a concrete way. It's a minor way, but a concrete way to see that in the system is through explosives, grenades, and blast. Okay. Which is a great example where if you have an explosive or any weapon with the blast quality, but it also has pierce, that pierce does not carry over to the blast if it activates. Okay. Yeah. But an increased damage typically does, because that does inform the blast number. So, just one minor way to think about that. But I mean, that it's a minor distinction, but it is there.
Yeah, exactly. Now, from a design perspective, weapons with pierce are going to provide a more even spread of damage rather than only damaging characters with a low soak, as we mentioned before. It also allows for your NPCs to be more effective to everyone in the party rather than just the people with that low soak, which is important for balancing your encounter designs. The other thing, as you alluded to, Chris, is the imagery that a weapon with a high pierce quality represents. A deadly weapon able to ignore armor and deliver its damage straight to the target is one that's going to strike fear into your players or anyone. So effectively, pierce is just as much about the theme of the weapon as it is the mechanics behind it. However, if you really want to get frightening with, jagged edges and whirling buzzsaws and things like that, pierce is probably not what you're looking for anyway. That's the realm of vicious, which is going to add to the critical hit ratings that you're rolling when you make a critical hit.
Yeah. But back to the original question, it really is a subtle distinction.
Yeah.
Which I hope we've pointed out. And as even then we've gotten clarification on there's a bit of diminishing returns when you start getting above Pierce 5.
Yeah.
And on that point, as a side note, I have to close by saying this. If you think something should have Pierce of 10 or more, then you should just forget that altogether and, of course, look at Breach.
Yep.
But honestly, if you're looking at a weapon with a Pierce of 5 or more than 5, why? You should probably be in the realm of Breach anyway, just for those aspiring designers out there.
Exactly right.
Good question.
Well, hopefully that answers the question. Yeah.
All right, so we got a last question coming in from Chris Mordica via Facebook. Grappling. He says, I understand that grappling is rolled into the advantage/threat system, but how does one character stop another character from moving past it down a corridor? As I understand the game system, the moving character would engage the blocker and then be able to spend a maneuver disengaging.
It's an interesting question. Now, there are 2 talents which are from Realms of Terranoth, which kind of touch base on this, on how we should be looking at it. But which are Grappling, or Grapple, I think it's called. And the other one is it Nimble? I think is the other one, or something like that.
I think so.
Or Nimble, maybe from Shadow of the Beanstalk as well. And how those 2 interact. But basically, the Nimble allows you to move out of hand-to-hand without it actually costing you a maneuver. And Grapple allows you to cause the person who's moving to take 2 maneuvers as opposed to 1. So how do you do that without that talent? Because it's obviously very, very specific to Realms of Terranoth. The easy answer is you bring it into your goddamn game because it's a great talent if that's what your character is really good at. But otherwise, you do need to house rule it a little bit. And that can be things like if you're, rather than making a brawn attack, you could perhaps try to grapple someone. And that's going to be things like, you have knockdown as an ability that you automatically get with any sort of a brawling attack.
Exactly.
So, use that. Say, instead of a knockdown, I'm going to hold them in place. And so that means that they might need an additional maneuver to get out if you don't have the grappling, the grapple talent. Or it might take an action to get past someone. Again, the rules aren't going to be able to cover everything. There's only so many pages that they can fit into these books, and there does need to be a certain level of common sense applied when you're looking at these sorts of rules. So if you've got a 5x5 corridor and you've got a big burly orc who's standing in the middle of the corridor and preventing you from going past, it's a barrier. You're going to have to make some sort of check to get through that barrier. And that may be some sort of stealth check. It might be a resilience check if you're trying to force him forward. It may be any number of checks to be able to do, but that's going to take you an action to do. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to get past, because you've still got, technically, 2 maneuvers that you can play around with if you're willing to spend the strain. So, it's not the end of the world, but you do have to apply some common sense. Your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, everything you said is absolutely correct. Grappling has always been an interesting concept in the narrative dice system. I don't think it's ever been fully fleshed out really well. And quite frankly, I don't know that I've ever really wanted it to. This is not a tactical system. When we talk about, how do I stop him if he's going to engage with me and then have to disengage? And I hate the disengagement rules anyway. I dislike those in the system. They're not very cinematic to me.
No.
I think the key thing that Huli said was, keep in mind that the brawl skill is not just used to deal damage. It is also the de facto skill used for any type of grappling or maneuver like that. There is nothing, rules as intended, from stopping a PC from saying, look, I want to, when this guy enters my space, I want to attack him, or I want to get up there. I want to use brawl on him, but I'm not trying to hit him. I'm trying to immobilize him. Okay, and put that condition on him for a round.
Yep.
Okay. And if you're successful, okay, then you've done it. And you know what? If you're going to do that, it's not even an attack at that point. It's honest to God. I mean, this is raw. It's an opposed check.
Yeah.
Okay. You've spent your action to initiate that grapple, make the brawl check, and it's opposed by that person's brawl themselves or their coordination. Okay, another great way to bring coordination, which is an often underused skill, into the game.
Yep.
As a defensive skill. And that's assuming you're the person trying to do the block. If you're the person trying to run the block, trying to get past that orc standing in the middle of the 5-foot hallway, again, what a great opportunity for an opposed check. It's like, I'm going to race past him. A GM, ooh, okay, well, as a part of that maneuver, I need you to give me an opposed coordination check or vigilance, maybe, okay? Opposed by their brawl. And those are some really great suggestions to do it with. And honestly, you got to treat it, with success in either area, especially if you're trying to hold somebody down. Don't make it permanent. Treat it like, basically it's you know what, they're immobilized for a round. Okay, you've grappled them. They're immobilized for a round. On their round, maybe they get a chance to break free. Okay, they can make an opposed check on their turn, and then if they're successful, they've got a maneuver to get the heck away from you. And run like the wind. Failing that, when it comes back around to your turn again, this grapple's still ongoing. If you want to keep the immobilization effect, make another opposed check. All right. Those are the ways I've commonly dealt with it when players have asked, and it's always seemed to work really well. Opposed checks are kind of the hidden gem of the system. Yeah. They can solve almost any problem you really want to do that the rules don't directly explain.
Absolutely. And to channel Jay Little here for a bit, what we have is a scenario here that, just to go back to what you said, Chris, is that you've got a player who said that they want to do something. The GM says, yes, you can do that, but if you fail, this is what's going to happen. If you succeed, this is what's going to happen. You then set the difficulty of that. You agree in a social, to the social contract of that's what the difficulty is that you're agreeing to. You're agreeing to what the expectations of that check are going to be. And I know I keep going back to the expectations, but that's what this, for player satisfaction and GM satisfaction, that is so important. That you've got that agreement, you then make the check. If you succeed, you abide by that condition, by that social interaction that you've had, that contract, and then that happens on the table. But if you fail, the player knows what's going to happen when the fail happens, so that's what happens. Move on. Yeah. And,
through all this, Huli, we've forgotten probably the best suggestion that we can give for this entire situation. Go to the Foundry and purchase Ready Fight by Team Capital. Because experienced developer has written some pretty freaking phenomenal rules for this kind of situation. And they're great. And you can just use them.
That's right. Exactly right. So just go straight to the Foundry and download that product. And I've been told that Keith is very, very close as of today. Now, when people are listening to it, it may have tipped over, but he was so close to going over into Electrum, and we've got some news about that, which we'll discuss in future episodes about products that go over into that Electrum category. So, but we'll talk about that at a later stage. But Chris, Monica, hopefully that has answered your question with regards to grappling. Thank you very much for asking it. So that brings us to the end of our show. If you have any questions like these fellow listeners have had that you'd like to ask us and have us answer about developing your own content for Genesys, being a GM or player, or general questions about the rules themselves, you can send us an email to forgegenesis@d20radio.com, or you can post your questions to either Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, probably Discord, and definitely Reddit by searching for Genesys. And of course, if you're lucky, you might get us to read the questions here on the show. And also be sure to join the ever larger group of discussions that go on at the D20 Radio Facebook group, where we nerds congregate to cross-pollinate.
And don't forget to give us a like as well, okay, for Facebook. And, of course, reviews are extremely important. So drop us a review on your favorite podcatcher, iTunes. And you can also visit us on our website, forgegenesis.com, and listen to all of our episodes on YouTube. And if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, even if you never plan to listen to these episodes on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, because if we can just get 100 subscribers on YouTube, I know it's a weird thing to listen to podcasts on YouTube, but if we can get 100 subscribers on YouTube, we can get a short link, and that really helps us.
And we've managed to get there, just as a side note.
We there?
We're there. We're there. So,
oh my gosh, we're there. That's so great.
So they can, so if you just search for Forge Genesis, you will definitely be able to find us on YouTube, which is great. And look, more and more people are listening to episodes on YouTube, and don't think that we're just going to have our episodes listed on YouTube and that's it. My intention is to do some basically Genesis 101 on YouTube at a later stage as well. I'm just learning the skills at the moment for editing on video content. So if you're really interested in that sort of stuff, look out in the next few. I'm going to say, like Scott did, up to 3 months. So it depends on how we're going to go. But yeah, look, certainly be sure to tune in to our next episode, where our topic for the furnace is going to be a fascinating one, to say the least, as we talk to our special guest, Katrina Lee, or as some of you know her, Katrina Ostrander, formerly of FFG.
That's right. I'm very thrilled by this topic. Katrina, who's been a guest of honor at Gamer Nation Con in years past, has agreed to come onto the show and talk to us about a topic that we very briefly touched on actually tonight with Scott Zumwalt. And that topic is layout and design specifically. Each of the adventures and settings that make their way to the Foundry have to be created to comply with the format that FFG has posted to the Foundry. But beyond that, because this is a digital and not a print medium, there is a tremendous amount of unconsidered things that you can do to really amp up your product, make it unique, and also eminently more readable and consumable to the readers out there and the gamers out there. And so considering all that, Kat has agreed to take a deep dive into this topic to help us and to help you get a much better appreciation of what is required and what it can go beyond to make your product that much better. But all that is next time.
Indeed. I cannot wait. Katrina is absolutely amazing to listen to. Her website I've certainly got it bookmarked, because she's got some amazing stuff on there, and I'm sure we'll talk about that during the episode as well. Well, that's a wrap for us. Thank you for listening, and we hope that you will join us next time as we continue to explore the Genesis role-playing game. I'm GM Hooley. May your triumphs be many and your despairs be few.
And I'm GM Chris, wishing you peace, love, and good gaming.
Thanks again for joining us, and remember, the Forge Podcast, helping you hone your gaming edge. The Forge, a Genesis podcast, is a proud member of the D20 Radio Network. For more information about the network, visit www.d20radio.com. The Forge is a fan-generated podcast. All the information provided on the podcast, social media, and related website is not affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or any of their licensors. The content of this podcast remains the property of the Forge, a Genesis RPG podcast, and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The Genesis role-playing game, Genesis logo, Genesis Foundry, content, and all material remain the property of Fantasy Flight Games. All products available on the Genesis Foundry website remain the property of their respective companies and individuals. For more information about the Forge, a Genesis RPG podcast, visit www.forgegenesis.com.